Welcome to Neighbors Recounted, where real people share the stories they never thought they'd speak out loud. Out here, in the deep silence of the Appalachian woods, every camper, every hiker, every wanderer has a moment that changes the way they look at the darkness forever. Tonight's story is one of those moments. As you listen, imagine yourself on that ridge with nothing but a thin layer of nylon between you and whatever moves in the night. And when the story ends, tell us what you think. Would you have stayed? Would you have run sooner? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've had your own encounter in the woods, share it with us. Your story might be the next one we tell. Now, settle in. The ridge is waiting. I still remember the way the night air felt on my skin that June evening. Cool, unmoving, almost suspiciously calm, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting for something I couldn't yet understand. Max Patch had always been the kind of place people spoke about like a postcard. Wide open balds, rolling ridgelines, and a sky so open it felt like you could fall upward into it. I'd hiked there a dozen times, but this was the first time I'd ever camped alone. My name is Aaron. I'm 31, born and raised in Western North Carolina, and I've spent most of my life in these mountains. Not because I'm looking for peace, but because I've always trusted the woods more than I trust people. But that night taught me that the woods have their own rules, and sometimes those rules turn against you. I'd chosen a spot just below the ridgeline, not far from the Appalachian Trail, tucked between a cluster of rhododendrons that offered a little cover from the wind. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when I noticed something off. Not in a dramatic way, not in some movie-type omen. It was small, barely noticeable. But when you've grown up in the Appalachians, you learn to listen when the woods go quiet a little too quickly. The birds stopped first, then the bugs, then even the wind died as if it was afraid to move. I told myself it was nothing, a passing weather shift maybe, but my stomach tightened anyway, like some part of me already understood that the night wouldn't go the way I'd planned. By the time darkness settled in, the temperature had dropped more than I expected for early summer. I cooked quietly, mainly out of habit, because any local knows that scents travel far across bald ridges. I wasn't worried about bears. Max Patch sees plenty of hikers, and most bears avoid human areas. But what bothered me was the feeling that something was already watching me. It wasn't paranoia. I'd spent too many nights in these mountains to confuse nerves with instinct. Something had changed in the environment. Subtle, but unmistakable. After dinner, I walked the short slope back up to the bald to get one last look at the sky before bedding down. From the top, you can see the layers of the Blue Ridge rolling away like waves, and on clear nights, the stars feel so close you could run your hand across the sky and smear them. But that night, the horizon felt wrong. Too dark, too empty, as if the ridgelines were absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening, trying to identify whatever was bothering me. The world was silent, except for the sound of my own breathing. When I finally returned to camp, I zipped myself into the tent and lay down, still fully dressed, a habit my father drilled into me when I was young. Never sleep in the woods like you're in a bed, he'd say. Sleep like you might have to run. I used to laugh at that, but around 3 a.m., I realized he hadn't been joking. I woke without knowing why. No dream, no noise I could identify, just a sudden jolt of awareness that snapped my eyes open. The inside of the tent was pitch black, and for a second I couldn't tell whether I had just woken up or if something had woken me. My heartbeat was already fast, too fast for someone who'd simply been stirred from sleep. I stayed perfectly still, listening, barely breathing. For a long moment there was nothing. Then I heard it, soft, deliberate, unhurried steps coming from the direction of the ridge. Not an animal, not the wind, footsteps. Slow, measured, heavy enough to compress the dew-soaked ground. They were too rhythmic, too intentional, the way a person walks when they're scanning the terrain. I felt my throat tighten as I counted each step, trying to map the movement in my head. They weren't approaching from the AT. They were coming down the ridgeline directly above my camp, a place no one hikes at night unless they're lost or avoiding the trail on purpose. I reached for my headlamp, careful not to make a sound, but I didn't turn it on. Light attracts attention, and I needed to understand before reacting. The footsteps stopped suddenly. Right above my camp, maybe 10 yards up the slope. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. The pause was long enough that I wondered if whoever or whatever it was had spotted my tent. My chest burned as I forced myself to keep from gasping. Then came the sound that chilled me deeper than anything else that night. A low, quiet exhale. Human. Close. Controlled. Someone was standing above my campsite in total darkness at 3 a.m., breathing as if they were trying not to be heard. I lay there frozen, realizing there was no logical explanation for that. No backpacker hikes without a light. No hiker wanders away from the AT into unmarked brush at that hour. No one approaches a stranger's tent in silence. I waited for a long time. Could have been 10 seconds or 10 minutes. Fear bends time into something unrecognizable. Then the footsteps started again, but this time they moved sideways, not down toward me, but across the slope, pacing slowly, thoughtfully, as if circling. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out the distant hum of the valley far below. I had two options: stay silent and hope they moved on, or reveal that I wasn't asleep, wasn't vulnerable. I chose something in between. I cleared my throat, loud enough to be heard but not aggressive. The footsteps stopped instantly. The breathing stopped. The entire mountain seemed to freeze. That's when I knew for certain I wasn't dealing with a hiker. I don't know how long the silence lasted, but eventually the footsteps resumed. Only now they moved faster, still controlled but with longer strides, heading past my campsite toward the tree line. I followed the sound until the darkness swallowed it completely. I waited another full minute before moving, then slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The moon was hidden behind a thick drift of clouds, but there was enough ambient light to make out the ridge. No one. Nothing. But I saw the tracks. Fresh impressions in the grass, leading from the ridgeline directly toward the spot where the footsteps had stopped, then angling away into the dark. Human footprints. One set. No dog, no pack, no gear, barely a scuff mark from the heels, meaning the person was stepping carefully, intentionally. I felt a trembling rise inside me, quiet but unmistakable, as I scanned the slope, the trail, the tree line. Every shadow felt alive. Every movement of grass seemed deliberate. And for the first time in my life in these mountains, I felt unwelcome, hunted, even. I backed into the tent and zipped it closed, but I didn't lie down. I didn't blink. I sat with my knife in my hand, listening to every sound between me and the ridgeline. And that's when I realized something worse. The woods hadn't gone quiet after the footsteps faded. They had stayed quiet, completely, unnaturally, suffocatingly quiet, as if the forest wasn't reacting to the intruder. As if it was waiting. The quiet became its own kind of pressure, settling around me like a weight I couldn't shake off. I kept telling myself that if whoever it was had wanted to approach the tent directly, they already would have. But that logic didn't stop my chest from tightening each time the fabric of the tent shifted or the wind brushed across it in slow, tense waves. Minutes stretched out until they felt like hours. The temperature kept dropping. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but the cold wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from whatever had stopped above my campsite, whoever had stood there breathing in the dark like they were memorizing the sound of me. Around 4 a.m., I couldn't take the stillness anymore. I needed to know if the person was still nearby. I slipped out of the tent as silently as I could, keeping low and angled toward the slope. My headlamp stayed off. I didn't dare break the darkness. The ridge was barely visible, just a faint outline against the starless sky, but I could make out the flattened grass where the footsteps had been. I followed the tracks up the slope for a few steps before stopping. Something about standing there in the exact place that person had stood made every instinct inside me recoil. I could feel the echo of their presence, the heaviness of it, like a residue clinging to the air. And then, faint but real, I heard something I hadn't expected, a A single, sharp crack of a branch somewhere deep down the opposite side of the ridge. Not close, not right on top of me, but not far enough. I crouched low, listening. A second crack followed, then silence again, as if whoever it was realized their mistake and froze. I stayed perfectly still, breath held, knife clutched so tightly my fingers began to ache. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, and after a moment I realized I was shaking, not from cold, but from the raw electric certainty that I was being watched from somewhere just beyond the slope. I was the only light-colored object in the open, a silhouette against the sky. A target. I backed down toward my tent in short, quiet steps. I knew I couldn't stay there until sunrise. Whoever was out there knew exactly where I was, and I had no idea where they were. I'd grown up knowing the woods, respecting them by relying on their rhythms. But this was different. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't weather. This was a person who had deliberately climbed a ridge at 3 a.m. without a light, come straight toward a lone tent, and then circled it without saying a word. Nothing about that belonged to normal mountain life. Back inside the tent, I packed only what I absolutely needed: water, headlamp, my phone, and the knife already in my hand. I left the stove, sleeping bag, and most of the gear behind. I didn't have time for more. Every second felt like it could be the moment I heard those footsteps returning. Faster this time, closer, more certain. I unzipped the tent, stepped into the dark, and pulled the zipper closed behind me with slow, deliberate care, as if sealing the tent might somehow hold the night back. The trail was about 40 yards beyond the rhododendrons. Normally, that distance feels like nothing, but walking it in pitch-black silence with the knowledge that someone unseen was somewhere nearby made the world shrink around me. Each step felt amplified, too loud, even though my feet were barely brushing the ground. I kept checking behind me, eyes scanning the ridge, the tree line, the empty shape of the tent. At one point, I swore I saw movement near the rhododendrons. Just a shift, a darker shadow passing behind the branches. But when I froze and stared, it held perfectly still. Halfway to the trail, I realized something I should have noticed earlier. There were no other lights anywhere on the bald. Max Patch draws campers every weekend in the summer. Even on weekdays, you see the glow of distant headlamps, the flicker of someone boiling water or reading before bed. But that night, the entire mountaintop felt deserted. My campsite was the only sign of human life, and suddenly I wondered if the person on the ridge knew that before I did. When I reached the trail, I turned toward the forested section that led back to the parking area. I hated going into the trees. The darkness is thicker there, the sound doesn't travel the same way, but staying exposed on the bald made me feel like prey. I clicked on my headlamp only once. I was deep enough under the canopy that the beam wouldn't be visible from the ridge. Light exploded across the trail, a harsh white that made everything look too close, too sharp. Every root looked like a hand. Every branch looked like a figure leaning forward. I moved quickly, not running, but not walking either, listening for anything behind me. My ears strained for footsteps, breathing, movement, anything that didn't belong. Twice I thought I heard something. A quick shuffle followed by total silence, but I couldn't tell if it was real or just my nerves twisting the night into shapes that weren't there. The trail dipped and curved, and each time I rounded a corner, I imagined someone waiting just out of sight. About 15 minutes in, I stopped abruptly. There, in the dirt to the right of the trail, was a footprint. Fresh, deep, human. Not mine. I crouched down, shining the beam over it. The shape was clear. The direction was unmistakable. It was facing uphill, toward the ridge, toward my campsite. It wasn't the print of someone fleeing or wandering. It was the print of someone approaching. Someone who had climbed the trail earlier in the night. Someone who had passed through this exact spot hours before I woke up. My breathing tightened as a realization settled over me. Whoever had stood above my tent hadn't just been wandering the mountain aimlessly. They had come from the direction of the parking lot. That meant they knew someone was camping up there long before they arrived. I stood slowly, forcing myself to keep moving. The trail grew narrower as it dropped toward the switchbacks, and the trees felt like they were closing in from both sides. For a moment, the night smelled different, like damp earth mixed with something metallic, something faint and unsettling that clung to the air. I couldn't place it, but it prickled the back of my throat. My gut twisted with a warning I've only felt a handful of times in my life. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps, behind me, closer than before. Not running, just following. I didn't turn around. Every instinct screamed to look, to confirm what my ears were telling me, but I knew better. In the woods, looking back signals hesitation. It tells whoever is behind you that you're afraid, that you're vulnerable. So I kept moving, steady, controlled breaths, eyes fixed on the beam of my headlamp, slicing a narrow path through the dark. But the footsteps matched my pace, never speeding up, never slowing down, always the same distance behind me. They were quiet, too quiet for someone unfamiliar with the terrain. Whoever it was knew how to walk in the woods without snapping branches, without dragging their feet. That kind of silence is learned. My mouth went dry, and I felt the weight of the knife inside my pocket like a lifeline. I waited for any sign, any break in the rhythm, but the steps kept coming. When I reached the first switchback, I veered sharply downhill, pressing myself against the inside curve of the trail and turning off my headlamp in one swift motion. Darkness swallowed everything instantly. I crouched low, letting my eyes adjust, holding my breath so long it felt like my ribs were locked in place. If the person behind me kept walking forward without seeing my light, I'd know they were following me, not just heading out, not just coincidentally on the same trail, but following. The woods held their breath with me. 10 seconds passed. 20, maybe 30. Then the footsteps reappeared, slow, deliberate, reaching the bend where I'd stopped. I tightened my grip around the knife handle, every muscle ready to spring, but the figure didn't step down the switchback. Instead, the footsteps halted exactly where my headlamp had been moments earlier. The person stood there, motionless. I felt their attention in the air. Heavy, intentional. They knew I was close, they just didn't know where. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, barely daring to breathe. My heartbeat thudded so hard I worried they could hear it. For a long time, neither of us moved. The woods felt too small for both of us. Then, without warning, a soft sound rose from the figure. Just a quiet inhale, but it was the same one I'd heard on the ridge. Controlled. Almost practiced. It wasn't curiosity. It was evaluation, the kind of breath someone takes when they're trying to stay calm. I felt sweat slide down my spine despite the cold. Another slow step, not toward me, but backward. Then another. The footsteps retreated, not down the trail, not up the switchback, but off into the trees. No hiker would do that. No camper would leave the trail in the dark on a steep slope. It was the kind of move only someone accustomed to stalking in the woods would make, someone who didn't care about tripping, someone who didn't want to be followed. I waited until the last trace of sound dissolved before turning my headlamp back on, dimming it to the weakest setting. My legs felt unsteady, but I forced myself down the switchbacks, moving faster now, listening obsessively to my surroundings. A few times I swore I heard something parallel to me in the distance, branches shifting, leaves brushing, but it never grew closer. It just paced the mountain, fading and reappearing as if shadowing me from far off. By the time I saw the first glint of metal from the trailhead sign, my nerves were stretched so thin they felt like brittle threads ready to snap. The parking lot was dark, completely empty except for my truck sitting alone at the edge. I scanned every corner before stepping out of the tree line, expecting movement, expecting that controlled breathing behind me again. But the lot was still, washed in the faint blue-gray of pre-dawn. I didn't waste a second. I unlocked the truck, threw open the door, and got inside. I hit the lock button 4 times in a row out of pure instinct, my hands trembling as the cabin filled with the sharp smell of cold air and old pine from the floor mats. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, forcing myself to breathe like a human again instead of an animal fleeing a predator. Right as I put the keys into the ignition, something caught my eye. The side mirror, angled toward the trailhead. A shape moved at the very edge of the woods, not stepping out, not approaching, just watching. The silhouette was tall, thin, unmoving. I couldn't make out a face, details, nothing. But it was enough to send a bolt of ice through me. I started the truck. The headlights blasted across the parking lot, and in the instant the beams swept over the tree line, the figure slipped backward into the dark, vanishing like it had never been there at all. I didn't wait for anything else. I drove down that winding mountain road faster than I should have, the gravel spitting under the tires, the trees flashing like bars on either side of me. It wasn't until I reached the paved section near Harmon Den that I finally let myself slow down. The sun was starting to rise, brushing the tops of the ridges with pale gold. Under any other circumstances, it would have been beautiful. But all I felt was the lingering pressure of the night, the sense of being followed by something unseen long after I'd left Mac's Patch behind. It took weeks before I went back into the woods again. And when I finally worked up the nerve to return, not to camp, just to hike, I stopped by the ranger station to ask if anyone had reported unusual behavior in the area. The ranger gave me a long, tired look and said, "People get weird up on that bald at night. You're not the first to come in here with a story like that." I asked him what he meant, but he didn't elaborate. He just shook his head like someone who'd seen too much. To this day, I don't know who or what stood above my tent at 3 a.m. that night in June 2022. I don't know why they circled my camp, followed me down the trail, or watched me from the trees when I thought I was finally safe. But I do know this. The mountains remember things we don't. They hold on to footsteps, breaths, intentions. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough to be alone in the wrong place at the wrong hour, the mountains send something back to remind you that you are never as alone as you think. Even now, whenever I hike near Mac's Patch, I can't help listening for that soft, controlled inhale in the dark, because once you hear it, you never forget it. The first thing I remember from that night wasn't the cold or the dark or even the sound of the river running below the cliffs. It was the feeling that something in those woods was already watching me before I ever stepped out of my truck. October in the Appalachian Mountains carries a particular type of quiet, the kind that presses against your ears and makes you feel like you're the only living thing for miles, even when you know that's never true. My name is Daniel. I was 28 at the time, and I had camped all across Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina since I was a teenager. But Backbone Rock was one of those places I'd always wanted to try and somehow never had. I figured a quick solo weekend trip before the real winter chill set in would do me good. A reset, a little silence, a little distance from the noise of everything else in my life. But I didn't know then that silence can turn on you. Silence can become something else entirely. I set up camp not far from the old tunnel, a narrow section of rock that was blasted through more than a century ago. Locals love to say that the forest around it has a memory, that once you get deep enough into the trees, the air shifts and the animals behave differently. I'd always thought of that as Appalachian folklore, the type told by older men in small diners who know the mountains better than they know themselves. But that first evening, when the sun dipped behind the ridgeline and the light drained out quicker than it should have, I started to feel the weight of those stories. It wasn't fear, not yet. Just a sense that the woods were paying close attention, that every movement I made echoed farther than it should. The first strange thing happened around dusk. I was gathering firewood along the slope behind my tent when a sudden crack, like a heavy branch breaking under weight, echoed through the trees. It wasn't the casual snap of a squirrel or the shifting of a deer. This was deliberate, slow, almost intentional. I froze, waiting for the follow-up sound, the footsteps, the brush of something moving through the undergrowth, but nothing came. Just the return of the river's low rumble and the unsettling stillness that wrapped around everything. I told myself it was a bear, or maybe a fallen branch giving out under its own rot, but something in my chest tightened as I carried the wood back to camp. That night, after I ate and let the fire burn low, I sat listening to the forest settle. Every so often, a gust of wind would push through the treetops, but past that, the woods were unnervingly calm. Too calm. Around 10 p.m., I decided to walk a little ways down the trail toward the overlook, just to shake off the cabin fever that comes from sitting alone with your own thoughts for too long. I had my headlamp, my knife, and enough confidence to tell myself I wasn't doing anything stupid. But a quarter mile in, I caught something on the edge of the trail that made my stomach flip. It was the outline of a person, or what looked like one, standing between two trees, far enough back that I couldn't see a face, but close enough that I could make out the shape of shoulders, a head, the subtle forward lean of someone watching. I stopped cold, the beam of my headlamp cutting across branches, leaves, and then that shape again. It didn't move, not an inch. My first instinct was to call out, but something about the stillness of that figure told me not to. I stood there for at least 10 seconds, my breath sounding weirdly loud in my own ears, until a cloud moved across the moon and the forest dimmed just enough that the outline vanished, as if it had never been there at all. I walked back to camp faster than I want to admit. Not running, but close. When I got inside the tent, I zipped it shut and sat still, listening for footsteps, for voices, for anything that would convince me there was actually a person out there and not just my eyes playing tricks on me. But the mountains went silent again, that heavy, unnatural sort of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from everything hiding. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to the sound of faint crunching, slow, measured, moving in a half circle around my tent. I didn't dare unzip anything. Instead, I stayed perfectly still, breathing shallow enough that my chest barely moved. The footsteps stopped directly behind me, no more than 2 or 3 feet from where my head lay. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and for a long moment, nothing else happened. No animal sounds, no sniffing, no shifting weight. Just presence, something standing there, listening to me breathe. Eventually, the footsteps moved again, retreating back into the woods with the same careful rhythm. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the handle of my knife inside my sleeping bag. When the sun finally broke through the mesh of the tent, the panic from the night before felt almost unreasonable until I stepped outside and saw the prints. They weren't bear prints. They weren't boot prints either. They were barefoot, human, and incredibly narrow. Each step pressed deeply into the soft soil as if whatever made them had lingered in each spot far longer than normal footsteps would. They circled the tent once, then disappeared toward the slope behind the trees, the direction where I'd first heard that branch crack. I thought about packing up and leaving immediately, but something in me needed answers. I kept telling myself it could have been a local messing with me, or another camper who wandered into the wrong spot. But Backbone Rock wasn't busy that weekend. My car had been the only one at the pull-off when I arrived. And those prints, there was something off about them. The distance between each step wasn't right. It was as if whoever made them was taking exaggeratedly long strides, unnaturally long, like they were covering ground faster than a normal person could while still walking. I tried to shake off the unease by hiking up to the overlook after breakfast. The trail was damp from the morning frost, and every sound, every bird call, every shifting leaf felt sharper than usual. At the top, standing above the drop where the cliffs fell away into miles of forest, I felt a momentary calm. A reminder of why I came, the quiet, the mountains, the sense of being somewhere older than anything in my life. But then I noticed something across the ridge. A figure, still, tall, positioned between 2 pines like it had been waiting the whole time, and this time it stepped forward. I didn't move at first. I don't even think I breathed. The figure stepped out from the line of trees just enough for me to notice the way its posture aligned unnervingly straight, as if every limb were held in place by something rigid beneath the skin. It wasn't close enough for me to see a face. The ridge was too far, but the way it angled its body, slightly turned toward me, made the distance feel irrelevant. I raised my hands slowly, partly to shield my eyes from the glare off the opposite slope, partly to confirm that what I was seeing wasn't a trick of the light. But the figure stayed perfectly still again, like it had only moved to make sure I saw it. Something deep in my instincts told me not to linger. I backed away from the overlook without turning my back, the ridge line beginning to blur as a low fog crept up from the valley. I didn't hear any movement from across the gap, but the silence behind me felt charged, electric, like the woods were holding their breath. When I finally made it back to the trail, I didn't stop walking until my camp came into view, and even then, the uneasy sense of being watched didn't ease up. It clung to my shoulders like a weight. By midday, clouds had rolled in thick and dark, casting Backbone Rock into a muted gray. I decided to gather my gear and drive into town for a while, partly to clear my head, partly because some instinctive part of me needed to be around people. Even a gas station clerk would have been a relief. But when I reached the small dirt pull-off where I'd parked, my stomach dropped. There were smudges along the passenger side window, long vertical streaks, not fingerprints, not handprints. More like someone had dragged the side of their face across the glass and then wiped it downward. I checked the interior to be sure nothing was missing. Everything was untouched. Cooler closed, backpack where I left it. The only difference was the scent, the faintest hint of damp earth, like someone had stood next to the car long enough for the smell of the forest floor to seep in. I wiped the streaks away and tried not to think too hard about it, convincing myself it could have been condensation mixed with dirt, convincing myself of anything that let me get back on the road without panicking. I spent the next few hours in Damascus eating a late lunch at a small diner and trying to rationalize the strange incidents. The figure on the trail, the footsteps, the prints, the shape on the ridge, everything could be explained, I told myself. A hunter. A hiker who preferred to go barefoot, a trick of distance, my mind filling in gaps because I was alone. Fear has a way of rewriting what you think you know about yourself, and I wasn't ready to admit that something truly dangerous might be happening. But the thing that truly unsettled me came when I was heading back to my truck. An older man with a weathered hat and a slow, uneven gait stepped out of the hardware store as I was passing. He paused, gave me a narrow look, and asked, "You up at Backbone Rock today?" I nodded. "Camping for the weekend." He didn't blink. "You camped the north side?" "Yeah. Why?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment he just studied me, like he was trying to decide whether to tell me something or let me walk away ignorant. Finally, he said quietly, "People don't stay on the north side long." He shifted his weight, lowering his voice. "Things cross through there. They don't bother most folks unless you get in their way." Before I could ask what he meant, he tapped the brim of his cap and walked off, leaving me with more questions than answers. I tried to catch up to him, but he disappeared down a side street before I could reach him. By the time I got back into my truck, the sky had darkened further, and the forecast was calling for heavy rain through the night. Every part of me wanted to check into a motel and leave my tent to drown in the storm, but I forced myself to return. My gear was still out there. My camp was still set up, and part of me didn't want to feel like fear was dictating my decisions. The rain began as I pulled into the forest road. Slow at first, gentle, the type of rain that makes the woods smell rich and ancient. But as I approached the trailhead, the downpour intensified, slamming against the windshield in sheets. I grabbed my headlamp, zipped my jacket, and started toward camp, the mud sucking at my boots with every step. The steady rhythm of the rain should have been comforting, but instead it amplified the isolation. Every sound became harder to track. Every shadow seemed to move. By the time I reached camp, the tent was sagging under the weight of the water, but still intact. My fire pit had filled with muddy water. Everything felt darker than it should have, even for a storm. I ducked into the tent, shook off the rain, and sat listening to the storm thrash the treetops. The woods sounded alive, not with animals, but with something shifting between the trees, something too steady to be wind and too deliberate to be coincidence. Around 9 p.m., the thunder faded just enough for another noise to break through. A single, sharp knock. It came from the tree directly behind my tent, one hard strike like someone hit the trunk with the flat of their hand. I froze, every muscle tightening. Rain hammered the roof, but the knock had been unmistakable. Human. Intentional. I waited, listening for footsteps, for a voice, for any sign of who or what it could be. But minutes passed with nothing but the storm resuming its rhythm. Then came the second knock. This one was closer, maybe no more than a foot behind where I sat. Lightning flashed, illuminating the tent wall, and in that split second of white light, I saw a silhouette. Tall, motionless, its head bent just slightly as if it were listening through the fabric. The light faded, and the silhouette vanished. But the shape of it, the angles, the height, the presence, stayed burned into my mind. I didn't sleep at all. I didn't dare move. I stayed sitting upright, gripping my knife as the storm raged, knowing something was out there, standing just beyond the thin barrier of nylon, waiting for the darkness to deepen, waiting for me to make a mistake. And then, sometime after midnight, I heard the zipper. Not mine. Something was trying to get in. The sound of the zipper sliding, slow, careful, deliberate, sent a shock of cold through my entire body. It wasn't the frantic rustling of an animal or the clumsy tug of branches blown by wind. It was controlled. Someone was easing the zipper upward inch by inch, testing it, feeling for resistance, trying not to make noise. I tightened my grip on the knife until my hand hurt and leaned forward just enough to see the silhouette of the zipper pull shifting in the dim glow of my headlamp. I knew that if I made a sound, even the smallest one, whoever was on the other side would know I was awake. Rain drenched the tent walls in waves, masking some of the finer sounds, but the rhythm of the zipper still cut through. It paused halfway, then started again, slower this time. I could hear the rain hitting something, a body, a coat, skin, standing inches from me, the sound of water running down its frame in irregular streams. When the zipper reached the midpoint, the fabric bowed inward slightly, like someone pressed a finger into it. Testing, mapping the space inside. I forced myself to stay still. I knew if I lunged or swung blindly, I'd probably get myself hurt first. But the thought of doing nothing felt worse. Just as the zipper pulled another inch, lightning cracked across the canopy and the tent flashed bright white. In that instant, the shadow outside snapped back like it had been caught doing something it shouldn't, and the zipper froze. The light died. The rain swallowed everything again. Silence thickened the air. Then came a sound I didn't expect. A breath. Deep, slow, and drawn out like someone inhaling deliberately through their nose. It wasn't human. Not fully. It was too long, too controlled, like whoever was outside was trying to memorize the inside of the tent by scent alone. My spine went rigid. I didn't blink. I didn't swallow. I just waited. Another breath. Closer this time. The zipper quivered. And then, all at once, the rain changed. It shifted direction sharply, sideways, slamming against the left side of the tent as a gust of wind roared through the trees. Branches creaked, leaves whipped. Something heavy hit the ground nearby. The storm had pivoted violently, and in that moment, the zipper jerked downward an inch, then another, then dropped completely, as if the hand holding it had vanished. I didn't move for what felt like an hour, though it was probably less than a minute. My ears strained for footsteps, movement, anything to reveal where it had gone. But the storm drowned everything. Finally, when my nerves could no longer take the waiting, I leaned forward, gripping the knife tightly, and pushed the tent flap open just enough to shine my headlamp outside. Nothing. Just the rain hammering the forest floor. No footprints. No shape. No figure running off into the dark. Only the deep imprints around the tent from earlier, the barefoot ones now turning into muddy pools. But then my light caught something. On the tree behind my tent, the same one that had been knocked on, a mark had appeared. A single vertical line scraped into the bark, long and straight, as if carved with a sharp stone. Fresh, bright against the dark trunk, a mark that hadn't been there the day before. I scanned the woods for movement, but the storm made everything blur. The rain bounced off branches, forming illusions of figures that vanished as soon as I focused on them. I backed into the tent and zipped it closed again, but the sense of safety was long gone. Nylon felt paper thin. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every branch hitting the ground felt like something approaching. I stayed awake until dawn again, my mind fraying from the constant tension, my limbs stiff, my throat dry. At first light, the storm finally relented into a soft drizzle, and the woods fell into a strange, heavy quiet, the kind that follows a night when everything alive has hidden deep underground. I stepped outside to inspect the area more thoroughly. The mark on the tree was unmistakable, carved deliberately, about 2 feet long, nearly straight despite the rough bark. But the strangest thing wasn't the mark itself. It was what lay beneath it, mud. But not just any mud, a small, perfect footprint pressed into it. Barefoot, narrow, deep. Facing the tent, only one. Like whoever had stood there didn't walk away. I packed my gear in under 15 minutes, hurried, messy, nothing folded properly. I didn't care. My only goal was to get off Backbone Rock before anything else happened. I slung everything into my pack, grabbed my poles, and headed toward the trail back to the car. But the woods looked different that morning. The trees felt closer, the air heavier, the trail narrower, as if the forest had shifted overnight, subtly rearranging itself to remind me I wasn't walking out alone. Halfway down the path, I saw something that made my breath catch. On the fallen log that crossed the trail, one I had stepped over the day before, another mark had been carved, a vertical line, identical. And on the wet surface of the log, pressed into the moss, was another footprint. Bare, narrow, facing the direction I was walking, not following me, leading me, inviting me. I kept moving, trying not to think about the implications. The closer I got to the parking area, the more the marks started appearing, on trees, on stones, on the ground, always in pairs, a carved line and a single footprint beside it. Never more than one, never showing a path in or out, only standing there, watching, waiting. I reached the trailhead shaking, soaked, exhausted, and ready to drive away without looking back. But when the gravel under my boots shifted into view and the road finally appeared, a new fear began rising from the pit of my stomach. Not from what I saw, but from what I didn't. My truck was gone. Only fresh tire tracks remained in the mud. Tracks that led away from the clearing. Tracks that weren't mine. Tracks that stopped abruptly 10 feet into the forest, where no vehicle should have been able to go. And beside those tracks, pressed deep into the wet ground, was a single barefoot print, pointing straight at me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My truck wasn't just misplaced. It was impossible for it to have gone where those tire tracks led. The forest on that side of the clearing was dense, tangled with undergrowth and roots, the kind of terrain no vehicle could push through without leaving behind shattered branches and deep ruts. But the tracks ended cleanly, like the truck had rolled forward 10 feet into the trees and then vanished. No broken limbs, no disturbed soil, just the faint, muddy imprint of where the tires had pressed down, and that single barefoot print beside them, angled slightly toward me, as if whoever made it had been standing there when the truck disappeared. I stepped closer, my boots sinking into the wet ground. My pulse thudded against my ribs, loud enough that it felt like the entire clearing could hear it. I crouched near the footprint, studying its shape. Narrow, long, the arch unnaturally deep. Human, but wrong. There was something distinctly off about the spacing of the toes, the length of the stride I had seen earlier on the trail. Like the proportions were just slightly skewed, enough to unsettle the mind without providing any definitive explanation. The rain had tapered into a thin mist by then, the kind that hangs low and clings to your clothes. It drifted between the trunks like smoke, softening the outlines of everything around me. That was when I realized the forest had gone silent again. That same crushing quiet from the first night, pressing against my ears, making my breath sound too loud. Backbone Rock wasn't just watching me anymore. It was listening. I forced myself to stand and back toward the road, eyes fixed on the empty space where my truck should have been. My keys were still in my pocket. I had taken them with me into the tent. So either someone had hot-wired the truck or it hadn't been driven at all. Neither option made any sense. My legs felt weak, like every muscle in my body was bracing for something I couldn't see yet. With no other choice, I started walking. The nearest town was several miles down the road, and the forest hugged the sides of the pavement tightly, leaving little room for comfort. The mist thickened as I went, swallowing the trees in soft gray veils. Every few steps I glanced behind me, expecting to see a figure appear in the fog, tall, rigid, motionless. I told myself to keep my pace steady, not to break into a run. Running would make me louder, more noticeable. Running would trigger the part of me that already knew something intelligent was following. After maybe half a mile, the shape of a fallen tree blocked part of the road ahead. Nothing unusual for the Appalachians after a storm, but as I approached, I noticed something carved into its bark. Not a natural split, not storm damage. A single, vertical line. Fresh, clean, cut with precision that didn't match the roughness of the wood. Beside it, pressed into the thin film of mud along the pavement's edge, was another footprint. This one was angled differently, not guiding me forward, blocking the path. I stopped, my stomach twisted. The air felt too still, like the forest around me was holding itself perfectly motionless, waiting to see what I would do next. A breeze should have been moving through the branches, but nothing stirred. It was the kind of unnatural stasis that doesn't happen by accident. Something was exerting its presence. A sound broke through the silence, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the fog. A tapping. 2 taps in quick succession. I spun around, scanning the mist. The noise had come from somewhere off the road, maybe 20 or 30 feet into the trees. The fog was too thick to see far, but I could make out the silhouette of a large oak, its trunk splitting into 2 twisting branches near the base. Something shifted behind it. A shadow, brief and subtle, like someone pulling themselves slowly back out of sight. My throat tightened. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I stood there, paralyzed, while the tapping came again, this time from a different direction, deeper in the woods. Then again, closer. The pattern wasn't random. It was coordinated, like something circling me, marking locations, communicating in a language I couldn't understand. Rainwater dripped from the branches and pattered onto the pavement. My heartbeat synced with the rhythm of the taps, speeding up as they moved around me in a widening arc. I realized then that the marks in the forest, the carved lines, the single footprints, weren't warnings. They were boundaries, territory markers. And I had crossed into the center of it. A flash of movement cut through the corner of my vision. I turned sharply just in time to see the outline of a tall figure standing between 2 trees, its form distorted slightly by the mist. It wasn't walking toward me. It wasn't fleeing. It was standing perfectly still, angled just enough that I knew its head was turned in my direction. Lightning flickered through the clouds overhead, illuminating the figure for only a heartbeat. But in that heartbeat, its posture was unmistakable. Shoulders too stiff, legs too straight, a tilt to its head that didn't resemble curiosity so much as calculation. When the light faded, the figure was gone. No footsteps. No movement. Gone. I didn't wait. I backed away from the fallen tree, stepping into the center of the road, keeping my eyes sweeping the fog for any sign of movement. I'd barely taken 3 steps when another carved mark came into view. This time on the guardrail, a long vertical slash through the metal, fresh enough that small shavings still clung to the ground beneath it. A footprint sat beside them. They weren't following me on the trail anymore. They were directing me, pushing me, guiding me somewhere I didn't want to go. By the time the forest thinned and the road began sloping gently downward toward the outskirts of Tennessee's small mountain towns, I was shaking so badly I had to stop to steady myself. My breath came in uneven bursts, each inhale scraping at my chest like I'd been running for miles. I turned back toward Backbone Rock, half expecting to see a figure standing in the mist, watching me from the place I'd just escaped, but the road behind me was empty. The forest, however, was not. Something shifted deep within the trees. Not a step, not a branch, but a low, resonant sound that vibrated through the ground. A hum, a growl, a pulse. I couldn't pinpoint it, but I could feel it travel up through my boots, into my legs, like the earth itself was warning me not to return. That was when I saw it. On the last tree before the forest opened into the distant farmland, a mark, a line, vertical, fresh, and beside it a footprint angled not toward me this time, but away, heading back into the woods, like whoever or whatever had followed me was returning to its territory, satisfied that I had finally left. But carved beneath the line, so small I almost missed it, was a second mark, horizontal, crossing the first, making a symbol instead of a boundary, a warning, not to me, but to something else in the forest. At first, I didn't understand what the cross mark meant. It wasn't like the others. Those had been directional, territorial warnings carved with clean intention. This one was different. The horizontal line slashed through the vertical one with uneven edges, as if carved faster, with urgency, maybe even fear. It wasn't guiding me anymore. It wasn't marking space or boundary. It felt like something had been interrupted, and the footprint beneath it, angled away from me, deeper in the heel than the toe, looked like whoever made it had turned quickly, leaving in a hurry. For the first time since October 2021, I wondered if the thing that had followed me, the silent figure that had watched me from between the trees, hadn't been the danger itself, but something being driven by it, something responding to something worse. I backed away from the marked tree, my breath fogging in the cold morning air. Though the forest was behind me, the sensation of being watched didn't fade. It clung to my skin even as the tree line thinned and the first houses of the outskirts came into view. I didn't stop walking until I reached a small auto shop beside a narrow strip of road, its gravel lot empty, except for an old Chevy with its hood propped open. A man in his 60s stood beside it, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. He looked up as I approached, soaked, dirty, shaking, and didn't say anything for several seconds. His eyes narrowed slightly, the same way the man in Damascus had looked at me a day earlier. "You been up toward Backbone Rock?" he finally asked. I nodded. "My truck's gone." He didn't seem surprised, not in the slightest. He jerked his head toward the garage office. "Come inside. Rain'll chill you to the bone." I hesitated, but the warmth of the doorway, the hum of the space heater inside, and the fluorescent lighting felt like heaven after the suffocating weight of the forest. He handed me a towel and a bottle of water. I took both, trying to steady my hands as he sat across from me at a small fold-out table. "How long?" he asked. "What do you mean?" He studied me. "How long did it watch you?" My throat closed. I don't know, since the first night." He nodded slowly as if confirming something he already suspected. "It don't do that unless something else is around," he said. "Something it's trying to keep distance from." I stared at him, adrenaline returning in a rush. "What else?" His jaw flexed. He looked toward the rain-streaked window, the forest hidden beyond the gray skies. "There's things in those woods we don't talk about openly," he said softly. "Not out of superstition, out of respect. That one, the tall one, the still one, it keeps to its part of the ridge, keeps others out, keeps folks from wandering deeper, like a boundary." A chill cut through me. "It was trying to help me?" He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head either. He just said, "It was getting between you and something you didn't see." I felt sick. Then what was I being kept away from? He let out a breath old men release only when they've lived with answers they wish they didn't know. "You ever see a place in the woods that feels wrong?" he asked. "Like the air's thicker, like ground don't take footprints right, like the trees lean in even when the wind's still?" I nodded slowly. Backbone Rock had entire pockets like that, places where sound died too fast and shadows held their shape too long. "That's where they gather," he continued. "Not the tall ones, the others." A beat of silence passed between us, heavy and cold. "What do they do?" I asked. He shook his head. Depends on the person. Some folks never notice. Others, he paused, others disappear without ever taking a step. A tremor passed through me. I wanted to deny everything he was saying, chalk it up to folklore, superstition, local myth. But every part of my experience, every instinct I'd ignored during the trip, every carved mark and footprint and silent moment snapped into a shape I didn't want to acknowledge. The tall figure hadn't been stalking me. It had been hurting me, keeping me on the edges, away from something I'd almost stumbled into, something that didn't reveal itself with silhouettes or prints, something that didn't need to. The man stood, walked to the counter, and returned with a small, rusted key. "Your truck will be found," he said. "Always is, usually somewhere it shouldn't be." He pressed the key into my hand. "But don't go back looking for it yourself." I swallowed hard. "Why not?" He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice until it barely rose above the hum of the heater. "Because if you go back, boy, you won't be coming out alone." The words settled in my chest like ice. I left the shop with a ride into town arranged and a silence that followed me long after I stepped away. The farther I traveled from Backbone Rock, the lighter my body felt, as if a weight had been lifted from behind my ribs. But the psychological imprint, the guilt, the dread, the awful realization stayed embedded deep in my mind. Someone or something had been inches from me that night I heard the zipper. But it wasn't the tall figure. And it wasn't trying to get inside the tent. It had been trying to drag me out. To this day, whenever October rolls around and the air shifts into that cold Appalachian stillness, I find myself thinking back to that final mark on the tree, the one with the crossed line, a signal, a warning, a line drawn between territories. Not everything in the woods cares if you make it home, but something out there at Backbone Rock did. Something silent, something tall. Something that watched the forest so closely because something else was watching me. And every time I close my eyes at night, I hear that zipper again, slow, careful, deliberate, and I remember the truth in the old man's voice. I didn't walk out of those woods alone. I was allowed to. I've learned that some nights in the woods don't just stay with you. They return, uninvited, years later, in the hours you're most tired and least guarded. And the night I spent at Red River Gorge in May of 2020 is one I still hear every time the wind moves the way it did back then, dragging through the trees like something searching for a way in. My name is Daniel. I was 26 at the time, and like most people who fall in love with the Appalachian backwoods, I didn't find the forest. The forest found me. I'd camped alone more times than I could count. My comfort with solitude was almost irresponsible. I knew the trails, the switchbacks, the sandstone ridges that curved like broken knuckles above the gorge. I knew the smell of rain before the clouds even gathered, and I knew how sound changed in the mountains, how it carried, how it misled, how it made you doubt your own sense of direction. But nothing, not even a lifetime of hiking those woods, prepared me for what I heard that night behind my tent. It was early May, when the air in Kentucky is warm but not yet swollen with summer humidity. A strange time, too. The world outside the woods was locked down, silent, unsettled. Red River Gorge had reopened with limited access, and the usual crowd of spring hikers hadn't returned yet. That quiet, that unnatural quiet, fed into everything that happened. I'd chosen a primitive site off Rough Trail, not far from a narrow ridge that overlooked the gorge. It wasn't an official campground, just a flat piece of ground I'd used a dozen times before, tucked between rhododendron thickets that grew tall enough to darken the area long before sunset. Locals avoided that stretch at night, not because of ghosts or legends or anything dramatic like that, just because sound bounced strangely there. Even my friend Mark, who grew up in Stanton, told me once, that spot eats your sense of direction alive. I didn't understand the meaning of that until later. The hike-in was normal, a steady climb, the familiar ache in my legs, the smell of wet leaves breaking down under the spring rains. By late afternoon, I had my tent set, my small fire pit built, and the calm, predictable rhythm of camp settling around me. The kind of stillness you feel in your chest before you ever hear it. I wasn't looking for adventure. I wasn't chasing a thrill. I was trying to clear my head after months of isolation and long-distance silence from friends I hadn't seen in weeks. The woods were supposed to be grounding, something real when the world felt anything but around dusk, the tone of the forest changed. It wasn't sudden. It crept in gradually, like temperature dropping without wind or warning. The birds quieted earlier than usual. The insects didn't pick up the way they typically did. The silence wasn't empty. It was tight, almost waiting for something. There's a point on nights like that when even your breathing feels too loud. I remember sitting beside the fire, poking at the burning cedar to keep the flames alive and feeling watched. Not followed, not threatened, watched. As if something stood just out of sight, studying me the way you watch a stranger from the end of a long hallway. I tried to shake it off. Wilderness paranoia is real, especially when you're alone. But the feeling didn't leave. When darkness fell, it fell hard. No moon, no glow through the canopy. Just a blackness that felt pressed against my skin. I cooked a simple meal, rehydrated rice and chicken, and forced myself to relax, telling myself this was part of why I loved solo camping. The rawness, the unpredictability, the way the woods turned into their own world after dark. It was close to 11 p.m. when I finally crawled into my tent. The forest was so quiet I could hear the faint scrape of my sleeping bag against the floor. My heartbeat felt like a physical sound in the air. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, listening. Nothing but stillness. No wind, no nocturnal animals, no rustling in the underbrush. It was unnatural. Red River Gorge never sleeps completely. I don't know how long I stayed awake, waiting for something to break the silence. Minutes, maybe. And then finally, something did. A voice. Not loud, not clear. Not even a whisper at first. More like the faint murmur of someone talking through fabric, just far enough away that you can't make out words, but close enough that you know it's human. I froze. It came from the tree line directly behind my tent. The hairs on my arms lifted one at a time. My body went rigid before my mind even processed the sound. At first, I thought it was another camper. That's what logic tried to offer me, something easy, something explainable. But the sound didn't fit. It had no timing, no cadence, no rise or fall that suggested actual conversation. It was like someone was speaking quietly but without trying to communicate, more like reciting or repeating or mouthing words they weren't fully forming. My first instinct was to unzip the tent, shine my flashlight, announce myself. But something deep in me, something old and primal, told me to stay absolutely still. The murmur stopped. Silence returned, thick and heavy. I held my breath, counted the seconds, listened for footsteps, branches cracking, the movement of someone walking toward or away from me. But nothing happened. Just as I began to wonder if I imagined it, the voice came again, closer this time, clearer, right behind the nylon wall. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the proximity, it was the tone. It wasn't panicked, it wasn't threatening, it was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that doesn't belong in the woods at midnight, behind a stranger's tent. And then came something worse. A second voice. Fainter, higher, speaking over the first one. Two voices overlapping, neither fully audible, like two people standing shoulder to shoulder facing my tent, whispering to each other about something I wasn't supposed to hear. I felt my pulse in my teeth. My breathing slowed to tiny, controlled inhales, my ears strained so hard it hurt. Neither voice had emotion. Neither sounded like someone lost, injured, or confused. They didn't sound drunk or high. They sounded intentional, like they knew exactly where they were, exactly where I was, exactly what they were doing. The voices stopped again. Then, after a single beat of silence, both whispered at the exact same time. The same tone, the same low volume, the same impossible closeness, right against the fabric. A sound so faint I almost doubted it was real. Hear him. My entire body turned to ice. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. I waited for footsteps, for hands on the tent, for anything. But the woods remained still. No retreating voices, no rustling leaves, nothing to indicate movement at all. And that was worse than anything, because if someone had been standing there, whispering inches from my head, they would have had to move. I would have heard it. The underbrush behind my tent was thick. No one could walk through it silently, unless they weren't walking, unless they were already there, standing still before they spoke. The air in the tent grew tight with panic. My mind raced through every possibility. Other campers messing around, someone lost using my light as a landmark, someone dangerous wandering the woods. None made sense. None explained the synchronized whisper. None explained the absolute stillness before and after. I lay there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only minutes, waiting, listening, holding my breath until my lungs burned. Then the forest finally made a sound. A single, sharp footstep, not behind my tent, not beside it, in front of it. I felt the vibration through the ground before I heard the weight shift. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Someone or something was now standing between me and the fire pit, which meant they had moved, and I hadn't heard a single step until now. I clenched my jaw to keep my teeth from chattering. Every instinct screamed at me to unzip the tent and bolt into the darkness, but running blindly through those woods at night was a death sentence. The figure outside shifted again, another step, closer to the tent door, then another. I could hear their breathing, low, controlled, not winded, not erratic, just waiting. And then from behind the tent where the voices had been came another whisper. Softer this time, almost gentle, but unmistakably real. Don't. Not a threat, not a warning, a command. That's when I realized the emotional dilemma I hadn't anticipated on this trip, the fear of choosing wrong, the understanding that in some situations neither running nor staying feels survivable, the horrifying awareness that danger had already decided its proximity, and I had no say left in it. I tightened my grip on the only thing I had, a small pocket knife in my sleeping bag, and forced myself to stay silent, praying the thing outside the tent couldn't hear the pounding in my chest. And then everything went quiet. Completely, utterly quiet. So quiet I could hear the blood rushing through my ears. Then came the sound that nearly made me cry out, a slow drag across the tent door zipper. Not unzipping, just touching it, running a finger or something sharp along the metal teeth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, as if feeling for a way in. The sound of that slow drag along the zipper felt like it reached beneath my skin. A soft scrape, almost delicate, but deliberate in a way that froze every muscle in my body. It wasn't the sound of someone trying to break in. It was someone testing the boundary between us. Someone touching the only thin layer of fabric separating their world from mine, back and forth, light pressure, measured movements, as if they were counting the teeth, as if they were memorizing the path inward. When the sound finally stopped, the silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it felt expectant, like the forest itself was holding its breath alongside me. My eyes were wide open, locked on the dark curve of the tent ceiling, but I didn't dare move even an inch. Any shift, any rustle of fabric, any sign of awareness felt like an invitation. I waited. I listened. I tried to convince myself that panic was distorting what I heard, that maybe it wasn't breathing, maybe it wasn't a person, maybe a faint exhale cut through the darkness. Not mine, not distant, right on the other side of the tent door. Slow, controlled, almost steady enough to sound relaxed. The kind of breathing someone makes when standing still, studying something, unhurried by time. My throat tightened. I swallowed so gently it hurt, terrified the motion would make noise. Then, in a breath that barely qualified as sound, the figure outside murmured, "He's awake." My vision blurred for a moment. I felt a coldness bloom beneath my ribs. The voice wasn't the same as the whispers behind the tent. It was deeper, male, or something close to it. Clear. Close enough that I could feel the vibration of the words through the thin fabric. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I didn't blink. My mind raced through every terrible possibility. A group of people messing with me, someone dangerous living off trail, some unhinged person wandering campsites at night. But none of those scenarios explained the way they moved, the way they whispered, the unnatural stillness between their steps, And the fact that there were at least 3 voices now. A twig snapped somewhere to my right, not far, maybe 10 feet from the tent, then another ahead of me, then another behind. Whatever was out there wasn't one person, and they weren't trying to hide anymore. The breathing outside the tent door grew quieter, almost like the figure lowered themselves, crouching, hovering, close enough that if I reached out my hand, I could have touched where their face should have been. That's when the first voice, the higher one from behind the tent, whispered again, "Not yet." Another answered from the right, "Wait." 3 voices, all aligned around my tent. I don't know how I kept from making a sound. Adrenaline numbed everything. My hands, my feet, even the ache in my lungs from breathing so shallowly. My mind tried to calculate chances of survival, escape routes, whether I could sprint toward the ridge overlook and lose them in the rocks. But every option ended the same way, cornered in the dark. And then, without warning, every sound outside stopped. No breathing, no movement, no whispering, no stepping through leaves, just a void. My tent felt like a coffin. The air inside was so still it was suffocating. I strained my ears so hard I could hear the soft, trembling pulse inside my neck. Seconds stretched into minutes, and then like someone flipping a switch, all 3 voices whispered at the same time. Low, unified, impossible. "He knows." I flinched. It was involuntary. A tiny jerk of my shoulder. The nylon crinkled beneath me. A single touch pressed into the tent wall near my feet. No handprint, no dragging. Just one point of pressure, firm and intentional. A fingertip, tracing upward. Following the outline of my leg, I sucked in a sharp breath through clenched teeth. The finger froze, then slowly continued. Up my calf, to my knee, to my thigh. Whoever, whatever, was outside my tent was exploring me through the fabric like they were mapping my body, studying its shape, learning its boundaries. My chest tightened, my vision tunneled. A tremor rolled up my spine. Then, from inches behind my head, the higher voice whispered, "Inside." A chill so sharp it felt surgical cut down my back. That was enough. Something primal, something old, something desperate inside me broke loose. And before my fear could stop me, I exploded upward into a sitting position and grabbed the zipper from the inside with both hands. For a moment, just a moment, the forest outside reacted. A shuffle, a gasp, a quick, sharp movement of leaves. The moment they heard me move, the fingertip at my thigh disappeared. The breathing at the door went silent. Something stepped back. But they didn't run. They waited, expecting me to look, expecting me to open the tent, expecting me to make the mistake. My fingers tightened on the zipper. And then I stopped. My instinct to flee met the realization that unzipping the tent meant putting my face directly in front of whoever stood on the other side. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, standing there, motionless, watching, listening. The seconds stretched so thin I felt them snap one by one, and then a new sound, a distant one, farther into the forest, footsteps, real footsteps, multiple sets, but heavy, human, normal, not creeping, not whispering, not circling, walking, voices followed, real voices. 2 men talking loudly, laughing. They weren't close, but close enough that sound carried through the hollow. The presence outside my tent shifted immediately, not with panic, with purpose. 3 quick steps, then silence. Then another step farther away, then another. No whispers, no breathing, no hesitation. Within seconds, whatever had been standing around my tent moved off trail, deeper into the woods, slipping through the brush with near-silent precision. I waited, frozen, listening until my ears rang. The real hikers continued down the distant trail, their voices fading naturally into the gorge. When their sound completely dissolved into the night, I was alone again. But the forest didn't feel empty, not fully. There was still a pressure in the air, something lingering, observing, retreating, but not gone, not yet. I stayed awake until the first hint of light pressed through the canopy. I didn't unpack. I didn't eat. I didn't even leave the tent until I was certain the sun had fully lifted past the ridge. When I finally stepped outside, that's when I saw the footprints. 3 sets. Bare. Dirty. Human. They circled my tent in patterns that made no sense. Tight loops, deliberate angles, paths that began and ended without direction. The footsteps behind the tent came right up to the nylon wall. The prints near the front stopped inches from the zipper. But the thing that made my stomach drop. One set of footprints was small, too small to belong to an adult. Yet the voice behind my head had not sounded childlike at all. I didn't stay longer than 3 minutes. I packed with shaking hands and hiked out without stopping once, not even for water. And the whole time, I felt a presence matching my rhythm. Not beside me, not behind me, but somewhere just far enough that I couldn't hear it. But close enough that it knew I was leaving. Close enough that it knew I'd come back one day, because people like me always do. And when I finally reached the trailhead, sunlight touching the gravel parking lot, I turned back one last time. The woods were still, but the silence wasn't empty. It was aware, watching, waiting. I never believed shadows could move without a body to cast them, until the night I camped alone in dolly sods where the sky feels too close, the silence feels too deliberate, and the dark feels like something alive, waiting. My name is Aaron. I'm 32, and I've camped in the Appalachian Mountains most of my life. I grew up just 2 hours from the ridgeline, raised by a father who believed a person should know how to read the woods the same way others read a map. He taught me the usual rules: watch the weather, trust your compass, never assume you're alone out there. But he never warned me about the kind of silence that can change the shape of your thoughts, the kind that dolly sods wore like a second skin that August. I hiked in just before dusk, starting from the Bear Rocks trailhead, weaving through low shrubs and blueberry bushes already losing their summer shine. The air smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet, heavy and expectant. Locals always talked about dolly sods like it had moods: fog that swallowed whole ridges, winds that changed direction without warning, trails that felt different from one day to the next. But I'd been there before. I respected the sods, but I wasn't afraid of it, at least not yet. I picked a spot along a clearing near the tree line where the spruce grew stunted and twisted from years of wind. The ground was soft, open, and quiet. Too quiet. No katydids, no distant cracked branches, no birds settling in for the night, just a stillness that made me slow my movements without knowing why. I set up camp the same way I always do. Tent first, then my small cook setup, then firewood for a night fire. The routine kept me grounded. It made solitude feel normal. But that evening, even the sound of my tent poles clicking together felt too loud, like the woods didn't appreciate the disturbance. By the time the moon rose, the fog had already crawled in, low and thin, blurring the distance. My fire was the only warm color in a world of cold grays. I remember sitting there, legs stretched out, hands wrapped around a metal cup of coffee, telling myself the quiet was just the kind that comes before a storm. Then the shadows started to shift. At first, it looked like the firelight was flickering against the rocks and brush, stretching thin silhouettes across the fog. Normal. Expected. But then the flicker stopped, and the shadows didn't. They kept sliding, slow and deliberate, as if adjusting themselves to get a better view of me. I blinked. They moved again. I stood up so fast my cup clattered onto the dirt. The shadows were the size of people, thin at the neck, wide at the shoulders. But there was nothing standing between me and the fire that could have cast them. Nothing tall enough. Nothing shaped like that. For a second, I thought it was just my eyes straining against the fog and flame. I stepped to the left. The shadows didn't react. I stepped to the right. The shadows stretched closer, bending unnaturally long across the clearing. My skin prickled. My instincts, the ones that had kept me safe through storms, animal encounters, and one terrifying night with a bear, were suddenly screaming. Not words, just a cold, primal warning. Something is wrong here. I grabbed my headlamp and swept the beam across the tree line. Nothing, just wet branches and swirling fog. But when the beam crossed the ground near the fire, the shadows vanished all at once, as if they'd silently snapped back into place. I should have packed up and left right then. I knew it. I felt it in my bones. But The nearest exit was miles away, and night hiking in Sods is a gamble even seasoned locals won't take. The ground is uneven, the fog can blind you, and one wrong step can send you off a hidden drop. So I told myself to sit, to breathe, to watch the fire and not the shadows. But deep down, I already understood something I didn't want to admit. Those shadows weren't created by the fire. They were watching it. They were watching me. The fire crackled softly, but it felt like the sound belonged to another place, somewhere safer, warmer, untouched by whatever was gathering in that fog. My pulse hadn't slowed. It thudded in my ears hard enough that I could feel it in my hands. Even when I sat back down, I didn't relax. My breathing stayed tight, controlled, as if exhaling too loudly might draw something closer. I kept my headlamp on, sweeping it slowly across the clearing every few seconds. The fog swallowed the beam after just a few yards, but each pass reassured me that nothing physical was standing out there. Nothing I could name. Nothing I could explain. But the ground at the edge of the light always felt like it held more than it showed. As the minutes stretched, the shadows began to settle into their normal shapes again. Or maybe they just pretended to. Either way, the clearing dimmed back into something that resembled normality, and for the first time since sunset, the woods offered a sound, a single distant pop like a small branch snapping under weight. It came from the west, deeper into the tree line. I froze. I'd been in these mountains since I was a kid. I know the sound of a deer hoof. I know the sound of a bear stepping on deadfall. This wasn't either. It wasn't natural and it wasn't casual. It was deliberate. I stood again, my headlamp already angled toward the trees. The beam cut through the fog just enough for me to see the outline of something tall standing between the spruces. Not moving, not shifting, just standing. The fog rolled past it, drifting like smoke around its shape, but no matter how long I stared, I couldn't make out a face or even a solid form. It was just height, presence, a vertical mass darker than the darkness around it. I whispered under my breath, "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't step forward. It didn't even tilt its head. It just stood, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath with me. I'm not someone who panics easily. Fear hits me slow, first in my stomach, then in my hands. That's how I knew this wasn't normal fear. This was deeper, instinctive, older than logic. I aimed the headlamp directly at it. The beam passed straight through. There was nothing there. I staggered back, my heel hit a rock, and I almost fell. The space where the figure had been, where I would have sworn there was mass and density, was empty. My breath came sharp and uneven. I felt stupid for a moment, almost embarrassed, like I'd imagined the whole thing out of tension. But when I lowered the light again, the shadows by the fire had shifted back into those stretched human forms. Closer this time. Not across the clearing. Not lingering like observers. They were just behind where I had been sitting. As I backed away, my light trembling in my hand, one of the shadows leaned forward, not realistically, not in any natural way. It bent like a hinge, as if its spine had no resistance, as if gravity didn't apply to it. Its head stretched closer to the firelight, absorbing the glow instead of bending around it. My throat tightened. My legs tensed to run, but I didn't know where to go. The fog made the clearing feel like an island suspended in nothing. And something in me understood. If I left the firelight, I might not find my way back. The air turned colder. Noticeably, sharply, like something had drained the warmth from the clearing all at once. My breath fogged in front of me, even though the night hadn't been anywhere near cold enough for that. That's when the whispers began, soft, barely audible, like wind forcing itself into shapes that resembled speech. They came from the fog, from the shadows, from everywhere at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unmistakable, slow, rhythmic, almost conversational, as if they were discussing me, as if they were deciding something. I covered my ears, but the sound wasn't coming through them. It was inside my head, threading itself through my thoughts like a cold needle. "No," I muttered aloud, my voice shaking. "Stop." The whispers didn't stop. They grew. My fire popped, a sudden violent crack, and sparks shot into the air. For a second, the entire clearing brightened, and in that burst of light I saw them, 3 long, thin shadows standing directly across from me, but with no bodies attached. Just silhouettes in a place where silhouettes had no right to exist. When the sparks died, they vanished again. I didn't sit back down. I didn't pick up my cup. I didn't blink longer than I needed to. My father always said the woods tell you twice before something goes wrong, once in the wind, once in the silence. But this wasn't wind. This wasn't silence. This was something else entirely, something that didn't care whether I understood it or not. I backed toward my tent, slow, careful steps, keeping the fire in my periphery. The shadows didn't follow me. They didn't move again. But the whispers stayed. They stayed even as my headlamp flickered, even as the fog thickened enough to smother the edges of my vision. Even as I reached for the zipper of my tent, knowing damn well that nylon walls wouldn't protect me from anything out there. But it wasn't about protection anymore. It was about distance. It was about survival. And it was about making it to dawn. I slipped into the tent and pulled the zipper shut with a trembling hand, though the sound of the teeth sealing together felt painfully small compared to the whispers still threading through the clearing. My headlamp beam bounced across the thin fabric walls, revealing only the vague outlines of spruce branches outside, distorted by the fog, stretching like fingers that didn't belong to the trees anymore. I sat on my sleeping pad, pulling my knees in, gripping my small emergency knife, though it felt as useless as a toy. I'm not the kind of person who hides from the woods. I've slept through storms, listened to coyotes yip just yards from my fire, and once crawled into my tent after spotting black bear eyes reflecting at dusk. But that night, in Dolly Sods, the tent wasn't shelter. It was confession. A thin, fragile booth where the truth finally caught up with me. The shadows outside weren't animal, they weren't human. And they weren't confused or wandering. They were interested, as if I'd walked into their clearing, lit my little fire, and announced myself like a beacon. Something in the way they watched reminded me of old stories told by Monongahela locals. Stories about the plateau having memory, about the sods holding on to things that got lost up there. Not spirits, not monsters, just impressions. Things left behind by people who never made it home. I tried to force my breathing to slow, counting each inhale like I'd done during cold nights in the Marines, but the whispers made counting impossible. They synchronized with my breath, rising when I inhaled, falling when I exhaled, adjusting themselves to match the rhythm of my lungs. That broke me in a way I wasn't prepared for, because whispers don't do that. Nothing in the woods does that. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, they stopped. No fade out, no drifting away. Just silence, carved and heavy. I lifted my head. The fabric beside my ear began to darken, not with moisture, not with shadow cast from the fire. Something was standing right outside the tent. I didn't move. I didn't even swallow. The shape was tall, impossibly tall, its height stretching well above where my headlamp beam reached. It didn't sway like a person shifting their weight. It didn't breathe in a way a chest expands. It simply existed, as if the fog had condensed into a single upright form. Every survival instinct in me screamed to remain still. Then the pressure began, a slow, deliberate push against the tent wall, first the size of a hand, then a shoulder, then something larger, like a torso bending toward the fabric. The nylon dipped inward, tightening against the frame poles, as if the figure were leaning in to listen. I backed away until my spine pressed against the opposite wall. I whispered, barely audible. Audible, please don't. I don't know why I said it. It wasn't rational, but nothing about that moment was. The pressure paused, then slid downward, tracing along the tent like fingertips dragging lightly across canvas. Not tearing, not testing, exploring. It reached the corner of the tent and stopped. The silence deepened again, so absolute that I could hear my heartbeat pulsing through the thin pad beneath me. Then, in a motion that still haunts me when I close my eyes, the pressure moved around to the front of the tent. Slow, deliberate steps that made no sound outside, but pressed firm contacts against the fabric each time the presence shifted. When it reached the zipper, the tent dipped forward. The silhouette of a head lowered itself, peering into the shape of the door flap as if it could see through the material. The fire outside crackled at that exact moment, and as the glow flared against the tent wall, the shape's outline became clear enough to make my breath catch. It wasn't a person. The head was too narrow, the shoulders too long, the posture too wrong. Then the fire snapped sharply again, sending sparks upward, and the silhouette vanished entirely. No footsteps, no rustle, no retreat, just gone. The silence that followed wasn't relief, it was worse than the presence. It felt like waiting, like the woods were holding their breath with me, both of us unsure of what would happen next. I didn't sleep, not even for a moment. I sat rigid, knife still in hand, headlamp pointed at the door, though I knew light meant nothing to whatever had been standing there. Hours passed, I don't know how many. Time loses shape when you're too scared to blink for more than a second. The fog pressed heavier against the tent, making everything outside dim and shapeless. Then, somewhere far off, the first real wind of the night sighed across the plateau. It didn't come from any direction. It came all at once, rolling over the clearing in a cold exhale that rattled the spruce branches. The fog lifted slightly, thinning into streaks, and the moment it did, the whispers returned, but this time they were faint, retreating like they were being carried away with the wind. The pressure never came back. The shadow never reappeared. When the sky finally began to lighten into that pale, bluish gray that comes just before dawn, I unzipped the tent with a shaking hand, expecting to see footprints or drag marks or something. But the clearing was exactly as it had been when I arrived, except for one thing. The fire pit I'd built, rocks arranged in that imperfect oval, was different. The stones had been moved. 3 of them stood upright, arranged in a small triangle pointing toward my tent, a marker, or a warning, or a reminder that I hadn't imagined anything, not the shadows, not the pressure, not the whispering silence that had pushed itself into my thoughts. I packed up without eating, without washing my face, without even brushing the pine needles off my gear. Every few minutes I checked the tree line, waiting for a shape to reappear, for fog to shift unnaturally, for the whispers to return. But the woods were awake now. Birds called, twigs cracked from normal animal movement. The plateau breathed like it usually does. And for the first time all night, I realized just how wrong the darkness had been. Dolly Sods is wild, harsh, unforgiving, but it isn't evil. What I felt that night wasn't the place. It was something that lives in the quiet parts of it, something that doesn't follow you home but waits for you to return, something the locals hint at but never name, something that noticed me. I won't camp there again. I tell myself it's because of the weather, the exposure, the unpredictable fog. But deep down, I know the truth. It's because the shadows there don't need light to move, and I don't ever want to know what they look like when they move without the fire. The night I realized how thin the line is between safety and something far darker began with the sound of my own heartbeat echoing inside a tent I thought would protect me. My name is Daniel Harper, 31 years old at the time, born and raised in Wythe County, Virginia. I grew up knowing the Appalachian woods like an old friend, quiet, unpredictable, sometimes cruel, but always honest. By 2019, I'd logged hundreds of miles on trails across the Mount Rogers National Recreation Area. I trusted those woods. I trusted my instincts in them. And in early September of that year, that trust nearly cost me more than I was ready to lose. I had planned a 2-night trip near Elk Garden, a spot I'd visited half a dozen times before. Early fall up there feels like a slow breath, daylight fading a little earlier, the air settling lower to the ground, the scent of wet grass and cold rock thickening as the elevation climbs. Camp solo. It's quieter, cleaner, and it forces you to pay attention. The only thing I didn't account for that weekend was how silence can shift, almost imperceptibly, into something predatory. I hiked in late that Friday afternoon, the sky an uncomplicated blue. the kind that makes you forget how quickly weather can turn in the mountains. I set up camp in a small clearing tucked between red spruce and beech trees. The ground was dry, the stream still running strong from August rain. For the first few hours, everything felt normal, routine even. I boiled water, ate a simple dinner, walked the perimeter of my site like I always do. Nothing out of place. No broken brush, no strange prints, no distant movement that didn't belong. But around dusk, the woods changed. I felt it before I heard anything. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing snapped or screamed or shifted. It was more like the absence of the usual. The crickets, the night birds, the faint rustle of small animals moving under the cover of darkness. It reminded me of being in a crowded room that suddenly goes quiet because everyone senses something they don't yet understand. I tried to ignore it. You have to sometimes. The mind can invent threats out of boredom. So I crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and told myself I was imagining things. The first sound came about an hour later. A slow, deliberate exhale, long, heavy, wet, somewhere just outside the thin layer of nylon separating me from the night. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked in place, as if moving even a little might draw the thing closer. I'd heard deer breathe before. I'd heard bears huff when they were irritated. I'd heard hikers talk, whisper, cough, laugh. This wasn't any of those things. This was different, too close, too steady, too human. My first instinct was to think it was another camper, maybe someone who wandered too far from their site or got turned around in the dark. But if that were true, they would have said something, called out, asked for help, apologized for coming near someone else's camp. Instead, whoever or whatever was out there stood silent, except for that rhythmic, unsettling breath. I tried not to panic. My mind raced through every logical explanation I could cling to. Maybe a hiker with a head cold. Maybe a large animal sniffing for food. Maybe the cold air distorting normal sounds. But logic was quickly losing its footing against the thing pressing its presence into the quiet. I slowly shifted my weight, trying not to make noise as I reached for the small flashlight near my sleeping bag. My hand shook so badly I could barely hold it. The second I touched it, the breathing stopped, just gone. Silence dropped over the campsite like a trapdoor, the kind of silence that makes you wish something would move just so you'd know where it was. Then a new sound, softer, more disturbing. Footsteps, not wandering or confused, not the uneven shuffle of a bear nosing around. These were measured steps, slow, deliberate, circling the tent with a patience that felt wrong. The grass compressed under each movement, like whatever was out there knew exactly how much weight it carried. I couldn't see a thing through the fabric of the tent, but I felt its path as it moved, as if it were dragging the cold air with it. I held my breath until my lungs burned. My chest tightened. There was a moment where I genuinely thought I might pass out if I didn't breathe soon. Then the footsteps stopped, right behind my tent. A stillness settled over the clearing. Heavy. Intentional. I listened for anything, breathing, movement, even the faint shift of clothing. But the silence was absolute. At one point, I forced myself to swallow, and the sound felt loud enough to give away my position. My fingers dug into the sleeping bag as I waited for something, anything, to break the tension. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. I lost my sense of time completely, measuring the night only through the pounding in my ears. Then came the sound that nearly made me scream. A single slow inhalation, not beside the tent, not behind it, above it. Whatever was out there was leaning over my tent, its weight shifting the air, its breath rolling down the fabric like warm fog. I felt it, heard it, sensed it in a way that bypassed reason. No animal in those mountains moves like that, and no person should have been out there without a light, without speaking, without intention. I gripped the flashlight so hard the plastic creaked. I didn't dare switch it on. Light can be a weapon, but it can also provoke. And the last thing I wanted was to provoke something whose nature I couldn't understand. It stayed there for what felt like forever, breathing slow and steady, as if studying the shape of me through the thin, fragile barrier. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I had never experienced in the mountains. I'd faced storms, injuries, unexpected wildlife, but nothing had ever felt aware of me like this. Nothing had ever felt personal. And then, just as abruptly as it began, the breathing stopped. The air shifted again, lighter this time. A step backward. Another. The grass moved under retreating weight. For the first time since the nightmare began, I allowed myself a breath. But I didn't relax, not even a little, because the footsteps didn't wander off into the woods. They moved to the edge of the clearing and stopped. And they stayed there. For hours. I didn't sleep. I didn't look outside. I didn't move except to keep my hand on the grip of the flashlight, like it was the only thing tethering me to the moment. The presence remained exactly where it had settled, as if keeping watch, as if waiting for something I didn't understand. Every so often I heard the faintest shift of weight, subtle, patient, almost thoughtful. It reminded me of someone adjusting their stance while observing a view they didn't want to disturb. The first hint of dawn, the faintest light, finally bled into the tent around 6 a.m., and as soon as it did, the thing moved. Not hurried, not startled, just leaving. Branches pressed aside, brush bending, footsteps fading into the tree line with a certainty of direction as if it knew exactly where it wanted to go. I waited another 20 minutes before unzipping the tent. When I stepped out, the clearing looked exactly as it had the day before, except for the ground. A heavy, wide path of flattened grass circled my tent in a perfect ring, and at the edge of the clearing, where the presence had stood for hours, the grass was completely crushed. Not trampled, pressed, like someone had been standing there without shifting for an unbearable amount of time. No prints, no claw marks, no tracks leading away, just the memory of weight. Just the feeling of being watched long after the watcher had gone. I packed up in silence, unable to shake the sense that something had followed me in the night without ever showing its shape. The woods felt different on the hike back, as if the trees were aware of what had passed through them, as if they were relieved it was gone, or as if it simply wasn't gone yet. I didn't tell anyone the full story for months. People in this region are comfortable with wildlife, storms, even strange noises at night, but there's no category for whatever that was. Nothing I've ever known in these mountains has breath like that. Nothing stands silently for hours without reason. And nothing moves above a tent without leaving a trace. I've camped since then, though never alone near Mount Rogers again. Some lessons stay with you. Some change the way you move through places you once considered home. And some remind you that the woods are far older than we are, and sometimes they let something else in. I left Elk Garden that morning with the sunrise behind me, casting long shadows ahead on the trail. Normally, that light feels warm, comforting, like the mountains are welcoming me back into the world, but that day it felt like the sun was chasing me out. Every step away from that clearing felt necessary, like distance alone could shake off whatever had stood outside my tent. But distance doesn't do much when the fear is already inside you. Even as the trail opened onto the familiar gravel of the parking area, I kept turning around, half expecting to see someone following me. Not running, not rushing, just standing there in the open like a reminder. But the trail remained empty, quiet, completely ordinary in a way that almost felt mocking. I reached my truck, tossed my pack inside, and sat behind the wheel longer than I care to admit. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from cold, but from the leftover weight of the night, a heaviness in my bones that no daylight could dissolve. I kept picturing that ring around my tent, the way the grass seemed shaped by intention rather than movement. Too wide for a person, too controlled for an animal, something that walked with purpose but didn't need to be seen. That detail stuck with me more than anything, the refusal to be seen. On the drive back toward Marion, I found myself scanning the tree line along the winding road, not searching for something in particular, just verifying the world stayed in its place. Cars passed, fields glowed in the late summer light, cows grazed, nothing out of the ordinary. But fear has a way of making even the most familiar landscapes feel unstable. That afternoon, when I finally got home, I spread my gear out in the yard. The tent, the stakes, the rainfly, every piece of fabric. I checked each one for rips, snags, bend marks, anything that would tell me something touched the shelter while I was inside, but the material looked untouched, perfectly intact. I kept thinking back to the moment when the breathing came from above the tent, the way the fabric moved, just slightly, as though displaced air or subtle pressure brushed against it. That movement wasn't a trick of the mind. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. But the evidence refused to cooperate. I tried talking myself down, reminding myself of black bears, eroded tree limbs, shifting thermal currents that can distort sound. But the logic sounded thin, like I was trying to patch a crack spreading across a frozen lake. The night didn't feel like a wildlife encounter. It felt calculated, observant, intentional in a way nature rarely is. The first person I really told, was my cousin, Mark. He's a volunteer with the search and rescue team out of Grayson County. If anyone would give me a grounded explanation, it'd be him. He listened quietly, not interrupting, not smirking the way I worried he might. When I finished, he exhaled and shook his head. "You're not the first person who's mentioned breathing out there," he said. Not like that exactly, but close enough. I didn't know how to respond. My mouth went dry. He went on to tell me about a hiker who, earlier that summer, reported hearing what he described as someone pacing around my tent like I owed them something. Another camper, a few years back, packed up in the middle of the night after hearing what she thought was a man humming behind the tree line but too steady to sound real. None of them saw anything. None found tracks. None had an explanation, but all described the same thing. Whatever it was, stayed just outside the boundary of light. Always just out of reach. The more stories Mark shared, the heavier the air felt around us, like the woods themselves were listening. I didn't sleep well for weeks. Every sound outside my house sent adrenaline through me, a branch falling, leaves rustling, even the wind pushing against the siding. I wasn't afraid of the woods. I'd lived my entire life in them. I was afraid of that intentionality, the presence that felt curious enough to approach but patient enough to wait. That patience is what haunted me the most. I tried returning to the trail 6 months later in early spring of 2020. The snow had melted, the ground soft and cold. The spruce trees near Elk Garden held the same weight they always had, their branches leaning into the wind like old men trying to hear better. I didn't camp that day. I didn't even walk the full trail. I just stood near the trailhead, breathing the cold air, trying to measure my fear. Was it memory? Or was it warning? And for the first time since that night, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had been avoiding. What if the thing that stood outside my tent wasn't passing through? What if it lived there? What if it knew the difference between people who belonged in those woods and people who didn't? I turned back toward my truck without stepping foot onto the trail. A part of me still believes I should have gone back sooner, forced myself to reclaim the space. But another part knows better. The woods don't always give second chances, and sometimes the only wisdom you gain comes from walking away before something decides to follow you home. Even now, years later, I haven't returned to that clearing. I camp elsewhere, deeper in the Appalachians, where the silence feels honest again, not watchful, not anticipating. But every now and then, when I'm lying in a tent miles from anyone, I think about that perfect circle in the grass. The weight, the breath, the patience, and I wonder, if I had unzipped the tent that night, would anything have been standing there? The question stayed with me long after the fear settled into memory, long after the nightmares thinned out, long after people stopped asking why I didn't camp near Mount Rogers anymore. It became a kind of background hum in my life, quiet, persistent, impossible to fully shut out. Some nights, when the house creaked or the dog lifted his head like he heard something I didn't, that question rose to the surface again. What if I had looked? It was late October 2020 when I learned something that shaped the ending of this story, though ending might be too hopeful a word. I was in a small bait and tackle shop in Troutdale, picking up supplies for a fishing trip, A couple of older locals were talking to the owner about trail closures, fallen trees, the usual mountain gossip. But then one of them mentioned a campfire someone found near Elk Garden that looked abandoned in a hurry, like the person had left in the middle of the night. Same spot as that incident last year, one of them said. Same old reports, breathing in the dark, someone walking circles around the tents. I didn't mean to interrupt, but my reaction must have given me away. The owner glanced at me, then at the two men, and let out a quiet breath. Not surprised, not skeptical, more like resigned. You know, he said, folks been telling stories like that up there since before I was born. My dad heard them from his uncle. Always the same kind of thing. Breathing, watching. Never shows itself, never leaves prints, never comes close enough to see. He paused, wiping his hands on a towel. Some say it's a person, some say it's an animal that doesn't act like one. Some think it's nothing at all, but everyone agrees on one thing. Whatever it is, it doesn't cross a threshold unless you give it permission. I asked him what he meant by that. He stared at me for a long moment before answering. Unzipping the tent, he said quietly, is permission. A cold feeling spread across my chest. It wasn't superstition. It was the way he said it. Calm, certain, like it wasn't folklore at all, but a truth passed down the same way hunters teach their sons to track or fishermen teach knots. I left the shop with that thought lodged somewhere deep in me, and it hasn't dislodged since. The years rolled on. I returned to different trails, different mountains. I rebuilt my sense of safety piece by piece. But fear, real fear, never disappears entirely. It lingers like the smell of smoke on clothing long after the fire dies out. Then, in September 2022, 3 years after that night, I received a message from a hiker I'd met once at an outdoor supply store. She knew I'd spent time near Mount Rogers and wanted my opinion on something strange she'd experienced on her last trip. She camped alone. She heard breathing outside her tent. Slow. Heavy. Too close. She said she'd lain awake for hours, gripping a knife she was too scared to use, while someone or something paced around her shelter. She never looked. She never unzipped the tent. By morning, she found a wide ring of flattened grass surrounding her campsite. She asked me if I'd ever heard of anything like it. I didn't know what to tell her. I still don't. Because the truth is, what happened to me isn't a story with a clean conclusion. It's not folklore. It's not a warning crafted for dramatic effect. It's something real that walked in circles around my tent, breathed above me in the dark, and stood still for hours as if waiting for an invitation. An invitation I almost gave. Some nights, when I'm alone in the woods, I still wake up thinking I hear that same slow exhale just beyond the fabric walls. Sometimes it's only wind. Sometimes it's nothing. And sometimes it isn't. The mountains hold old things, not supernatural things, not monsters, not ghosts, but old patterns, old instincts, old presences that were here before us and will remain long after we're gone. Whatever walked around my tent that night near Mount Rogers, it wasn't lost. It wasn't curious. It wasn't passing through. It knew exactly where I was, and it knew I was awake. I don't know if it ever wanted to come inside that tent, or if it simply wanted to see whether I'd open the door myself. But I do know this: if you ever hear breathing outside your tent, slow, steady, patient, don't unzip it. Don't call out. Don't move. Because some things in the Appalachian night aren't meant to be seen, and some of them, once seen, don't leave you alone again. The first thing I remember is the sound, the kind of soft, tuneless humming that doesn't belong anywhere in the woods, especially not on a cold April night when the ridgeline of Hawk Mountain feels empty enough to swallow a person whole. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 29 back then, just old enough to think I understood the woods, and just young enough to realize too late how naive that confidence can make you. I grew up in eastern Pennsylvania, hiking these trails since I was a kid. So when I took a short solo camping trip to Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in April 2022, it felt more like returning home than stepping into danger. The snowmelt was still clinging to the shaded parts of the ridge, and the air smelled like thawing earth. Quiet, still, unbothered. I'd been through dozens of overnights here, and nothing in my mind told me this trip would be any different. The locals always talk about the ridge as if it's alive. Not haunted, not dangerous exactly, just observant. They say the wind behaves strangely up there. They say you can hear voices sometimes carried from the valley floor in ways the geography can't explain. But none of that ever bothered me. Those stories felt like the kind of folklore people tell to give the mountain personality, something to whisper about at diners when the weather shuts everything else down. My plan was simple. Set up camp near an unmarked overlook I liked, stay one night, hike back at sunrise. No pressure, no rush, just a reset after a stressful winter. I parked at the trailhead, shouldered my pack, and started the climb. Everything felt normal. Gray sky, leftover patches of slush, the kind of silence that hangs heavy before spring truly arrives. The mountain felt empty, but not unfriendly. Not yet. 2 hours before sunset, I reached the clearing I always used. A flat patch of ground sheltered by an arc of mountain laurel overlooking a narrow cut in the ridgeline. It was the kind of spot only someone who knows the mountain well would ever find. I pitched my tent, collected deadfall for a small fire, and took in the last stretch of light as it dragged itself across the valley. Nothing was wrong. Nothing foreshadowed anything. That, I think, is what unsettles me most when I look back. How normal it all was. It wasn't until the fire had burned down to coals and the woods settled into that strange mix of quiet and movement that comes only after dark that things shifted. I remember sitting inside my tent, headlamp off, letting the cold work its way in as I listened to the forest breathe. An owl somewhere above me, the creak of old branches, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Then faintly, so faint at first I thought it was my mind filling silence with familiarity, I heard humming. Not a melody, not a tune, just a soft, continuous hum like someone barely exhaling sound. I froze. You don't hear humming in the woods at night. You don't hear voices unless someone is dangerously close to your camp, and there was no reason, none at all, for another person to be up near that ridge after dark. I unzipped my sleeping bag slowly, careful not to make noise, and sat still, head tilted, listening. The humming didn't stop. It didn't falter. It drifted through the trees in uneven intervals, like the person wasn't moving so much as swaying. For several minutes, I convinced myself it had to be wind, some strange pattern of air currents scraping against branches. But the longer it continued, the more undeniable it became. Someone was out there. A woman. Humming. Alone. No flashlight. No footsteps. No voice calling out for help. Just that hum. And the worst part, the part that made my chest tighten, was that it wasn't coming from the trail. It was coming from the woods behind my campsite, the steep side of the ridge where there were no marked paths, no safe footing, and no reason at all for someone to wander in the dark. I sat there, barely breathing, and the only thing I could think was how wrong it sounded. Not eerie, not ghostly, just wrong, like someone humming to themselves in a place where no one should hum. Then the humming stopped, and the silence that followed was even worse. For a moment, I thought the silence meant she'd gone, whoever she was, that maybe the wind had shifted or the echo had bent strangely along the ridge. But then I heard the leaves behind my tent compress under a slow, deliberate footstep. Not an animal. Not the clumsy, quick scamper of deer or fox. This was slow, human. One foot, then the next. My first instinct was to reach for the knife I kept tucked in my pack, but I stopped myself. A blade wasn't going to save me from whatever situation I had just slipped into. If it was a lost hiker, I didn't want to escalate anything. If it wasn't, well, metal wouldn't matter. So I stayed still, perfectly still, listening. Another step. Closer. I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my throat, the pulse drowning out the small noises of the forest. I leaned forward just enough to peek through the thin mesh of the tent door, the moonlight offering more shadow than clarity. The woods behind my camp looked ordinary, untouched. But the footsteps didn't match what I was seeing. They were too close, too real. I whispered the smallest sound I could manage. Hello? Nothing answered. but the sound of breathing, soft, almost measured, drifted just beyond the edge of the tree line. That's when the humming started again. This time, it wasn't distant. It wasn't carried by the wind. It was right there. Maybe 10 feet from where I sat, separated only by nylon and darkness. And now, with the closeness, I could hear something embedded in the hum, tiny breaks, little tremors, like whoever was making it was fighting to keep it steady. I didn't know whether to announce myself again or hold my breath. Every instinct in me felt split, half convinced this was a woman in distress, half convinced I was listening to something that wasn't operating on normal human logic. The humming grew louder. Not approaching, just louder, as though she had turned toward my tent, as though her mouth was pointed directly at me now. I shut my headlamp off completely, even though it wasn't on. That's how rattled I was. I tried to turn off something that had never been turned on. I slid back into my sleeping bag, not for warmth, but because some primal part of me wanted barriers, fabric, layers, anything. Then the humming stopped a second time. This time, it didn't drift into silence. It cut out, abrupt, sharp, controlled, followed by a whisper. I couldn't understand the words, not because as they were distant, but because they weren't words. It sounded like breath forming shapes that never fully became language, a cadence without actual syllables, the whisper of someone speaking to themselves, maybe, or to someone else I couldn't hear. My stomach dropped. That was when the fear shifted from confusion to the kind of dread that stretches into your bones. I forced myself to speak again, barely louder than the breeze. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The breathing paused. Then, impossibly slowly, the whispering turned into a soft, broken laugh, the kind someone makes when they've been crying or shivering too long. "Cold," a woman's voice finally murmured. One word, low, raw, cold. Every hair on my arms rose. The temperature had dropped sharply since sundown, and anyone out here without proper gear would be in danger. But something in her voice, it didn't sound like she was asking for anything. It sounded like she was telling me, informing me. Cold. I swallowed hard. "Do you want to come closer to the fire? I can help you warm up." The woods answered with another long breath. Then leaves shifted. Twigs snapped, a slow step, not toward the fire, not toward me, just pacing, maybe circling. I checked my phone. No service, of course, not up here. When I looked up again, I realized something that made my skin crawl. The footsteps weren't circling in a wide arc. They were tight, small, almost as if she were walking in place or rotating in a small radius, never straying more than a few feet in any direction. I don't know why, but that detail terrified me more than the humming, more than the whispering. Something about the idea of someone standing so close, turning slowly over and over in the cold, in the dark. That wasn't the behavior of a hiker who lost their way. It felt ritualistic, mechanical, wrong. I stayed frozen inside the tent, my breath shallow and sharp until the footsteps halted again. The humming returned, quieter now, like she was humming through closed lips, barely letting the sound escape. And then something new, something unmistakable. A second voice, not humming, breathing, right behind hers. Two people, standing no more than 10 feet away from my tent. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The humming rose, just a little, as if she had leaned her head toward the other person. Then the second voice exhaled sharply, a sound of irritation almost, and the humming ceased instantly, like she had been scolded. That's when I realized something I hadn't considered. What if she wasn't alone? And what if she wasn't the one in charge? The moment that second voice appeared, my mind snapped into a different kind of fear. An old, instinctive kind, the kind that warns you when you're being watched by something you don't understand. The breathing behind her was deeper, steadier, almost annoyed, as if the humming had been some sort of mistake, something she wasn't supposed to do. I shifted my weight as quietly as I could, bracing myself on my elbows so the nylon wouldn't rustle. The forest had its own rhythm, but this was something foreign laid over it, a presence that didn't belong. My first thought that it was two lost hikers crumbled the moment the deeper breathing turned into a low, guttural murmur, not speech, not even an attempt at words. more like a person trying to force air through a throat that wasn't fully cooperating. A warning sound. The woman responded by inhaling sharply, almost like a gasp, and then she whispered something too soft for me to make out. The man, or whatever he was, exhaled again, harsher this time, the breath fluttering the leaves. I remember thinking, they're not here by accident. The moon slid behind a cloud, and the woods darkened so completely that the outline of my own hand faded from view. The temperature dropped again, enough that I could feel cold seeping through the floor of the tent. I clenched my jaw to stop my teeth from chattering, not from the cold, but from the effort of trying not to make a sound. Then, with no warning at all, the woman stepped forward. I didn't see her. I heard her, the unmistakable sound of a shoe sole pressing into the wet patch of ground directly behind my tent, not the cautious step of someone hesitant or lost. This was deliberate, measured. She stopped just inches behind the thin fabric, slow breathing, a slight tremble in the exhale. And then, she placed her palm against the tent wall. The nylon dipped inward, pushing gently against the back of my shoulder. I went still, absolutely, completely still. My ribs felt locked in place. My lungs burned as I held the smallest sip of air inside them. Through the fabric, I could feel the outline of her hand, cold, thin, unmoving. She didn't knock. She didn't drag her fingers. She didn't test the material. She just rested it there, as if confirming that someone, me, was inside. On the other side of the tent, her partner shifted his weight, crunching through old leaves with a slow, dragging step. He was moving closer now, closer to her, closer to me. I don't know how long it lasted. 5 seconds, 10, a minute. Time stretched itself tight, thin, until everything felt suspended in that freezing patch of air. Then, with a quietness that terrified me even more, she spoke again. Not in a whisper this time, in a low, cracked voice right through the fabric. You shouldn't stay here. The words weren't threatening. They weren't angry. They were factual. You shouldn't stay here. My mind scrambled for logic. Maybe they were rangers, locals, people checking the ridge for fires. But none of that fit. Not the humming, not the whispering, not the pacing in the dark, not the way her hand remained pressed to the tent. I forced myself to speak, though my voice barely worked. I'll pack up. I'll go now. Just tell me what's wrong. Her fingers curled slightly against the nylon, the tips digging in just enough to pucker the fabric. Cold, she repeated. It's colder down there. Down where? The valley? The trail? A ravine? Before I could ask, the deeper voice behind her made another guttural sound, a short, angry burst. She withdrew her hand instantly like a child caught touching something forbidden. 2 steps backward, then 3. Silence. I lifted my head just enough to see the shadow of movement shift beyond the trees. Not the glow of flashlights, not the outline of bodies, just shapes, dark against darker darkness, pulling away from the tent. The woman resumed humming, but this time it was different. Faster, more frantic. And as her humming grew distant, the man's footsteps dragged behind hers, slower, like he was watching the woods even as he left them. When their sounds finally dissolved into the forest, I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs were locked in place, my hands shaking inside the sleeping bag as adrenaline fought every instinct telling me to run. It took nearly 15 minutes before I forced myself to sit up. I unzipped the tent door slowly, letting the cold night rush over my face. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. The clearing was empty, but the ground told a different story. Just a few feet behind my tent, illuminated by the faint silver of returning moonlight, were 2 sets of footprints. One small, delicate, barefoot, I realized, with a sickening jolt. The other long and uneven, dragging slightly with each step, like someone favoring a leg or resisting movement or being guided. Both sets trailed off into the woods, not toward the trail, not toward any safe route, just straight into the thick brush of the ridge. I knew right then that I couldn't stay. That whatever had stood outside my tent, whatever had touched the nylon with an icy hand, wasn't going to be satisfied with warnings if I tried to sleep through the night. So I started packing as quickly and silently as I could. That's when I heard it again, far from the camp but unmistakable. The woman's humming. Faint, fast, panicked. and a second sound layered behind it. Branches snapping, leaves thrashing, something running, not toward me, away, as if something else on the mountain had begun to chase them. And that, and only that, was what finally made me realize whatever those two people were afraid of was still somewhere on the ridge with me. I stood frozen over my half-packed gear, every muscle in my body pulled tight as piano wire. The woman's humming, distant but rising in speed, wasn't drifting through the woods the way it had before. It was cutting through them, sharp, frantic, like she was sprinting downhill. And whatever crashed through the brush behind her, it wasn't shaped like any human I'd ever heard running. Humans stumble. Their weight shifts unevenly. Their stride breaks when they grab branches or misjudge their footing. This thing didn't. Its movement sounded repetitive, rhythmic, almost four-limbed. Fast. Too fast for the dense terrain below the ridge. I killed my headlamp before I could even think. Not that it would have helped me to see anything, but I didn't want to be the only source of light in an entire mountain of darkness. My hands were shaking so violently that zipping my pack felt like trying to thread a needle in a windstorm. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing straight up, an electric awareness crawling over my skin. Whatever was on this ridge, whatever had frightened those two, was not far. I slung my pack over one shoulder, grabbed the tent with the other, and made a choice I still don't fully understand. I didn't break camp fully. I didn't collapse everything. I didn't leave the site clean the way I normally would. I ran, not toward the main trail. That would take me past the direction that humming had vanished into. I cut sideways across the ridge, taking a steep wildlife path I remembered from a hike years earlier. The soil was frozen in patches, slick in others. Twice I slipped, catching myself with hands that scraped against jagged rock. But I didn't stop. The entire forest felt alive suddenly, alive in a way that had nothing to do with wind or wildlife. Behind me, somewhere deep in the trees, the humming cracked abruptly into a scream. Not a long, exaggerated horror movie scream. A short, clipped burst, fear breaking through the mouth of someone who hadn't breathed properly in minutes. Then silence. Nothing chased her voice. Nothing responded. It was as if the woods swallowed the sound whole. My breath hitched. I forced myself up the last slope, fingers clawing at exposed roots to pull my weight. My lungs burned with cold, but I didn't dare slow down. I didn't dare think about what could silence a scream so fast. When I reached a thin break in the trees overlooking the next ridge, the moonlight spilled just enough pale silver to see shadows shifting far below, something large moving among the trunks. Not running, not stalking, just drifting. Sliding through the trees as if its weight barely touched the ground. I blinked hard, trying to make sense of it, but it was a silhouette more than a shape, too dark and too tall to match the proportions of a person. It paused once, turning, if turning was even the right word, and for a heartbeat I felt it angled toward me. Not looking, not scanning, sensing. I collapsed behind the nearest boulder, flattening myself against the cold stone as my heartbeat pounded so loudly I worried the mountain could hear it. I didn't know whether to close my eyes or keep them wide open. Every instinct fought every other one. I stayed there, pressed against the granite, listening to my pulse echo through my skull. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time lost all meaning in that cold, aching darkness. When I finally gathered enough courage to risk a glance, the shadow was gone. Not walked away, not faded, gone. The woods below were motionless, empty. I swallowed hard, forcing my trembling legs to straighten. I had one goal now, get off the ridge, alive. Before whatever that thing was decided, it wasn't finished with the mountain. I followed the slope down, moving slower now, careful with each step. The forest was too quiet, no owls, no wind, even my footsteps sounded muted, as if the air had thickened. Halfway down the ridge, I spotted something that made me stop cold, a long strip of fabric tangled on a low branch. I reached out with a shaking hand and lifted it. It was thin, worn, pale, a piece of a dress. And next to it, in the mud, a single footprint, the small barefoot one I had seen behind my tent. Fresh, leading downhill, away from where the humming had stopped. I followed her track only long enough to realize two things at once. One, her prints veered sharply to the left, toward a narrow ravine. Two, the larger, dragging prints, the ones belonging to the man, were nowhere to be found. Not behind hers, not alongside, not ahead. They vanished completely. I backed away, pulse racing. I didn't want answers anymore. I didn't want to know what had chased them or why only one set of tracks continued down the ravine. I pushed on until, through the trees, I finally glimpsed the faint, familiar outline of the main trail, a long, winding shape cutting through the dark. I've never felt relief like that in my life. I half ran, half stumbled until my boots hit that packed earth, and then I kept going, every step bringing me closer to the parking lot and farther from that nightmare of a ridge. When the first hint of dawn seeped over the horizon, painting the edges of the sky with dull gray, I reached the trailhead. My truck sat alone in the empty lot, covered in cold dew. I fumbled the keys, dropped them, picked them up with numb fingers. And just as I opened the door, something made me freeze. A sound drifted faintly down from the ridge, not humming, not screaming, singing. A soft, broken melody, rising and falling without pattern, a woman's voice, too far to be clear, too eerie to mistake. I climbed into the truck, slammed the door, and drove until the mountain was nothing but a dark, jagged line in my rearview mirror. I never told the police. I never told any rangers. Part of me knew they wouldn't find anything. No footprints, no fabric, no sign of a woman humming in the woods with a man who breathed like he was dying. But sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind slips through the cracks of my old windows, I hear it again. That same soft humming. Right outside, like she followed me, or worse, like she was sent to find me. And every time I remember her hand pressing through the nylon of my tent, her voice cracking in the cold, "You shouldn't stay here." I still don't know if she was warning me or claiming me. I always thought silence in the woods was supposed to feel peaceful, but on that October night in Linville Gorge, the silence felt like it was studying me, memorizing every breath I took and every mistake I didn't know I was making. My name is Andrew, 34 years old, born and raised in western North Carolina, and no stranger to the Blue Ridge or the rough, unforgiving cuts of the gorge. I'd been hiking its ridges and scrambling its boulder fields since I was a teenager, long enough to know the difference between normal forest noise and something that shouldn't be there. Long enough to understand that Linville Gorge doesn't care who you are. If you come unprepared or unlucky, it will teach you a lesson you won't forget. That weekend, I wasn't unprepared, but I was alone. I'd spent most of September dealing with a breakup and a workload that was grinding me down, and by early October, I was desperate for a night where I didn't have to hear anything except the wind cutting through the pines. I planned a simple overnight. Nothing crazy, just a quiet camp near the western rim, down a side trail I'd taken dozens of times. It wasn't a popular area. In fact, most locals avoid that section unless they know it well. The terrain is steep, the trails fade in and out, and the drop-offs can ruin your entire life in one misstep. But I'd always felt at home there. I reached the trailhead late in the afternoon. The air was cold in that aggressive fall way, where every gust feels like it's stripping color from the trees a little at a time. The sun was already sliding behind the ridge as I hiked in, and those long shadows stretched across the path like someone had laid dark ropes over the ground. I tried not to pay attention to it. The gorge has a way of playing tricks with light. By the time I reached my campsite, a small, flat clearing between two old pines, the sky was already drifting toward blue-gray. I set up quickly, boiled water, ate a quiet dinner, and settled into the kind of stillness I'd been craving for weeks. But stillness isn't always comforting. Even before full dark settled in, I noticed how dead the woods felt. No thrashing squirrels, no distant calls, no rhythmic tapping of a woodpecker. Nothing. Just the wind brushing low through the leaves like someone dragging their fingertips through dry paper. I remember thinking maybe it had something to do with the weather. Maybe a storm was coming. Or maybe the animals sensed something I didn't. The first strange moment happened around 10 p.m. I was sitting by the fire, just watching the flames collapse into glowing orange shapes when I heard something trot up the ridge behind me. 4 quick steps, light, precise, like a deer that hadn't decided whether to run or freeze. I turned my head slowly, not wanting to startle it, but the steps just stopped. Not the way an animal stops. No rustle, no shift of weight, no quick exhale through a nose, just an abrupt, unnatural silence, like whoever or whatever was behind me suddenly realized I was listening. I waited. Maybe a minute, maybe longer. Then the woods settled again, and the cold felt a little sharper than before. I tried to shake it off. Animals freeze all the time. But the longer I sat there, the more something in my stomach tightened. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left my boots, pointed toward the exit, and my headlamp beside my sleeping bag. Old habit, just in case. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong in the forest. Not at that hour. Not anywhere. It was faint at first. A slow, steady movement across the leaves. Not footsteps. Not the hopping or scratching of an animal. This was dragging. A long, deliberate pull, like something heavy being slid across dry earth. One drag, then a pause. Another drag, then another long pause. At first, I thought it might be a fallen branch being moved by the wind. But the night was still. Not silent, still. The air felt locked in place. Even my breath sounded too loud. The dragging came from the left side of my tent, maybe 20 feet away. I felt my chest tighten as I tried to picture what could possibly be moving like that. A bear? No. They don't drag themselves, they stride. A boar? Too noisy. A person? My hands went cold. I listened as the dragging continued, slow, uneven, like someone pulling a large, awkward weight. The pauses between each movement felt intentional, almost like whoever was making the sound was stopping to listen, to see if I was awake. When the sound finally stopped, the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise itself. And then something exhaled. Not human, not animal, just a soft, breath-like release of air that came from much closer than I wanted to believe. Right outside the tent wall, inches away. My heartbeat felt like it was shaking the ground beneath me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I didn't even blink. I just laid there, staring into the darkness, waiting for whatever was outside to make the next move. The next move didn't come. Minutes passed, slow, punishing minutes, until the woods settled again. But they didn't feel right. They felt suspended, as if the forest were holding its breath right along with me. And that's when I realized I wasn't sure if the dragging had been moving toward my tent or away from it. Either answer terrified me. The minutes after that were the longest of my life. I kept telling myself to move, to sit up, unzip the tent, shine my light, do something, but my body wouldn't obey. It felt like fear had poured concrete through my ribs and lungs, weighing everything down. Even my fingers felt locked in place inside my sleeping bag. Eventually, the cold forced me to shift. My breath had started to leave thin trails of condensation inside the tent, and the temperature had dropped fast, the way it does in the gorge when the night decides it wants to remind you who's in control. I lifted my head just enough to look toward the fabric of the tent wall. Nothing moved. Nothing pressed against it. No shadows shifted. If the thing had been there, it was gone now. But the quiet didn't go back to normal. It was a different kind of quiet, deeper, like the forest had shut itself down and was waiting for something. I lay there listening, trying to convince myself it was over. Then, faint but distinct, I heard the dragging again. But this time it wasn't moving. It wasn't shifting around camp. It wasn't circling. It was just there. Stationary, as if whatever had been pulling itself across the leaves had finally reached its destination and stopped, settled somewhere in the dark just beyond my campsite. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. A weight in the air. A presence pushing at the edges of the silence. It was far enough that it didn't touch the tent, but close enough that my instincts screamed at me not to leave the safety of the thin nylon surrounding me. My headlamp was still beside me. I reached for it slowly, trying not to make noise, but the moment my hand brushed the plastic, something cracked in the woods. Sharp, brittle, like a broken branch or pressure. Not the random snap of a twig. Not the echo of movement. It was a response. I froze again. Whatever was out there heard me. The crack wasn't followed by footsteps or dragging or breathing. It was followed by another stretch of silence so deep it felt like the whole gorge was listening, waiting, watching. I lay there, headlamp in my hand, arguing with myself in whispers inside my own mind. If it's a person, you need to know. If it's an animal, light will scare it away. If it's neither, what then? At around 2 a.m., after more than an hour of stillness, something shifted in me. Maybe it was adrenaline burning itself out. Maybe it was a moment of clarity. Maybe it was the realization that I couldn't stay inside that tent forever. But I finally sat up. Very slowly, I unzipped the tent door, just a few inches at first. The sound felt too loud, like it was tearing through the silence. When nothing reacted, I pushed it open farther and aimed my headlamp through the gap. The beam caught the leaves immediately. Brown, dry, layered thick from the fall. Some were flattened, some turned over, and some pressed into a small but visible trail that cut through the clearing. A drag trail. Wide and uneven, like something heavy had been pulled through the brush. But the trail didn't go far. It stopped at the tree line. Just ended, as if whatever made it had vanished into thin air. I scanned the woods, moving the beam deliberately, trying not to rush. The trees swayed just barely in the breeze, their shadows bending and stretching across the ground. Every few seconds, I thought I caught the shape of something, an outline, a shoulder, a crouched figure. But each time I focused, it dissolved into branches and darkness. I stepped out of the tent, boots crunching through the leaves. The cold hit me hard, like the temperature had dropped even more in the last hour. My breath fogged instantly. I followed the drag marks slowly, each step feeling like a decision I couldn't undo. When I reached the end of the trail, I stopped. There were no footprints, no disturbed brush, no sign of an animal, just the leaves, dragged and parted in a wide arc, then suddenly untouched, as if whatever had made the trail simply disappeared the moment it reached the tree line. I aimed my headlamp deeper into the woods, and that's when it hit me. The silence wasn't just silence. It was absence. Every familiar forest sound, the ones you don't consciously notice until they're gone, was missing. No owls, no insects, no rustling, just the low hum of wind moving through dead leaves, almost too soft to hear. And under it, something else, not dragging, not walking, just a presence, heavy, focused, a feeling like being observed from a distance you can't measure. The trail behind me, the untouched forest ahead, and somewhere in the dark, whatever had come close enough to breathe against the fabric of my tent. A question formed in my mind, not a dramatic one, not even a fearful one, just a simple, cold realization I couldn't shake. What if it hadn't been dragging something across the leaves? What if it had been dragging itself? I felt that thought settle into the marrow of my bones. Before I could decide what to do next, something shifted deeper in the trees, a sound so faint I almost mistook it for my heartbeat, a low, uneven exhale, not like before. This one was farther away, watching me. And then another sound came, one that froze the air inside my lungs, a second exhale, from a different direction. There was more than one. The second exhale came from somewhere down the ridge, low, muffled, like it was buried behind the trees. The first one had been closer, maybe 50 yards out. The second was farther, but deeper, as if whatever made it was larger or struggling. I swept my headlamp between the 2 points, the beam slicing through the dark in quick arcs, but all it caught were shifting shadows and the long, twisting arms of mountain laurel. Something primal moved through me then, some instinct older than language, telling me I was standing in the open between two things I didn't understand. I backed up toward the tent automatically, not taking my eyes off the tree line. Every step I took made the leaves whisper beneath my boots, and at every whisper felt like a signal. When I reached the tent, I stopped. I didn't crawl back inside. I didn't even look at it, because suddenly the tent didn't feel like shelter. It felt like a bright, thin target in a dark place where I absolutely did not want to be seen. The dragging trail lay beside me, that wide, uneven mark carved through the leaves. I crouched next to it and ran my hand lightly through the disturbed earth. The cold had frozen the ground just enough that the pattern still held. The line wasn't smooth, it wasn't consistent, it was stuttered, jerked, almost as if whatever had moved through here had to stop and brace itself before pulling forward again. I'd seen a lot of animal sign in my life: bears, elk, wolves, even human trespassers. This wasn't any of them. There were no paw prints, no hoof marks, and no boot prints, just the drag. The forest shifted again. A faint breeze moved through the treetops, but it wasn't enough to camouflage what came next. A creak, a low wooden groan, like weight pressing down on a fallen trunk. Then the dragging resumed. Not near me, not at the tent. Farther out, maybe 40 yards this time, moving parallel to my campsite, slow, measured, deliberate. The second one, wherever it was, didn't move. It just exhaled again, deep and strained, like something working air through damaged lungs. I felt something creeping up my spine then. Not panic, not terror, but recognition. I'd heard something like this once before, years ago, when an injured man had been pulled up a slope by rescue workers after a fall. He'd been breathing like that, ragged, pained, fighting for each inhale. That's what this sounded like. Not a creature stalking, not an animal hunting, something hurt, something suffering. But suffering doesn't drag itself in circles around a campsite at 2 a.m. I felt my mouth go dry as I followed the parallel movement with my light. The beam caught gaps between trees, patches of underbrush, a sloping piece of granite, nothing. The dragging stayed steady, like whatever was moving didn't care whether I saw it or not. Then suddenly, the sound stopped, cut off mid-drag, like a rope pulled taut, then dropped. I stood there listening so hard my ears rang, waiting for the next movement, the next breath, anything to tell me where it had gone. But the woods sealed themselves again in that unnatural quiet. Almost a full minute passed before I realized something else had changed. The second presence, the one that had been breathing down the ridge, silent. Both of them were gone. No dragging, no exhale, no shifting weight, just the sound of my own pulse thudding behind my ears. I backed farther from the tent, scanning the woods in slow, methodical sweeps, and that's when my headlamp caught something near the far pine, something I hadn't noticed earlier, a mark on the tree. I stepped closer, cautiously, every instinct telling me not to turn my back on the forest. When I reached the tree, I raised my light. The bark was scraped clean in a straight vertical line, about 2 feet long, maybe 2 inches wide, fresh, no moss inside the groove, no rot. A clean, sharp cut, but it wasn't made by a blade. It was too uneven, too wide, too jagged. It looked like something had hit the tree, not swung at it, not clawed it, hit it, or maybe been dragged past it. My stomach tightened again. That line matched the width of the drag trail. I reached out and touched the scraped bark. It was cold and slightly damp, like the mark hadn't been there long. And as I leaned in with the light, I noticed something else, embedded fibers near the bottom of the groove. Thin, pale, almost like cloth, clothing. Before I could process it, something cracked sharply deeper in the woods, farther than before, but unmistakably real. A single crack, a snap of weight on branches, not moving toward me, not circling, retreating. Whatever had been near my camp was leaving. Both of them. I didn't follow. I didn't call out. I didn't try to understand. I just stood there, rooted in place, listening to that deep forest silence settle over everything again, like the gorge was reclaiming its night, wiping away the evidence of something I was never meant to witness. When the last echo faded, I felt my knees weaken. My breath finally came back in shaky, uneven waves. And in the stillness that followed, one realization rose above everything else, something I couldn't shake then and still can't now. Whatever dragged itself across the leaves that night, whatever exhaled inches from my tent, it wasn't interested in me. It was escaping from something else, something still out there in the dark. I stayed frozen in the dark for several minutes, trying to convince myself that whatever had been out there was truly gone. But the human mind isn't built for silence that deep, not that kind. It doesn't soothe you. It pressurizes you, the way deep water does when you dive too far down. Every second of that quiet pressed harder against my skull, and I knew I couldn't wait for daylight in the open. I backed toward the tent, but the second my hand touched the fabric, something in me recoiled. That thin nylon had felt like protection a few hours earlier, but now it looked fragile, transparent, like hiding inside it would only make me easier to find. I grabbed my pack and dragged it out into the clearing, closer to the small circle of light cast by my dying fire. The embers glowed faintly, red and slow, like coals hiding under ash. I crouched beside them, feeding in small sticks one at a time, trying to coax the flames back into something bright. My hands shook. I couldn't tell if it was the cold or the adrenaline or the fear that the dragging sound might return the moment the fire dimmed again. As the flames rose, the forest took a small step back. The shadows retreated. The tree line gained shape. The world felt a little less like a void waiting to swallow me whole. But even then, even with the fire burning brighter, I kept my headlamp aimed at the woods. I knew something had passed through my camp. I knew it had been close enough to breathe against the tent, but I didn't know where it had gone, or why it had been fleeing, or what it had been fleeing from. That last part stayed lodged in my mind like a thorn. I sat there for over an hour, tending the fire, watching the woods for even the slightest flicker of movement. Nothing came. No dragging, no snapping of branches, no breathing. Just the mountain night, vast, indifferent, swallowing the last pieces of warmth from the fire. Around 4:30 a.m., something changed. The air shifted. Not the wind, just the air itself, like the entire forest exhaled at once after holding its breath for too long. And when it happened, the smallest sounds began to return. A distant chirp, the rustle of leaves overhead, a single owl call far down the ridge, the normal rhythm of the gorge, life waking back up. Permission to breathe again. I didn't realize how tightly I'd been gripping the headlamp until my fingers started to ache. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered it, letting the fire be my light again. I didn't sleep, not even for a second. I sat there until the sky shifted from black to a faint, bruised blue. Dawn in Linville Gorge is never gentle. It rises over those ridges like a blade, slicing through fog and shadow, revealing everything that hid in the night. I waited for that light like a drowning person waits for air. When the sun finally touched the clearing, I stood up and began scanning the area more carefully. The drag trail was still there, wide, uneven, cutting a shallow groove through the curled leaves and into the damp soil beneath. But now, in the daylight, I could see something I hadn't been able to earlier. A second trail. Fainter. Parallel. As if two things had crossed the clearing during the night. One, heavy and struggling. The other, lighter but controlled. Precise. My mouth went dry. I followed both trails to where they ended at the tree line. In the daylight, the scene somehow looked worse. The leaves were pulled aside in two long arcs, the heavier trail stopping abruptly at the roots of an oak, the lighter one bending off into the woods, disappearing among the shadows cast by the rising sun. I crouched beside the heavy trail again. The disturbed leaves were scattered in a fan, as though something had collapsed there or changed direction. The soil underneath had shallow indentations, not footprints, not paw prints, just pressure points, uneven, asymmetrical, like something had planted itself there before being dragged away or before dragging itself back into the trees. I followed the lighter trail with my eyes. That one wasn't scattered, no struggle, no uneven weight, just a clean path, as if something had walked or stalked around the clearing, watching, guiding, herding. The realization hit me so hard I had to steady myself against the trunk of a tree. The two sounds in the night, the two exhales, the two trails, one had been wounded, the other had been hunting it, and I had camped between them. I tried to think logically. Injured animals get hunted all the time. Predators follow wounded prey. But predators don't exhale like that. They don't drag themselves across leaves. They don't circle a human campsite slowly, deliberately, without revealing themselves. My pulse thudded again as I looked at the scraped pine from earlier. In the daylight, the mark was more disturbing. The fibers embedded in the bark weren't just pale, they were frayed, torn, like shredded cloth or old rope. Something had brushed against that tree with enough force to shear fibers into the bark. Not gently, not accidentally. Hard. The kind of force a body makes when it's hauled or when it's resisting. The forest behind me rustled just once, faintly, as the morning breeze moved through it. But after the night I'd survived, every small sound felt magnified, sharper, full of warning. I knew then that I couldn't stay, couldn't linger, couldn't pretend the night had been some strange coincidence. Whatever passed through my camp was part of something I wasn't meant to see. Something the gorge keeps hidden in its deeper ravines and shadowed ridges. Something the wildlife knew well enough to flee from long before I even heard it. I packed fast, faster than I ever have in my life. Every zipper felt too loud, every footstep too exposed, like the forest might shift again without warning and return to that unnatural, suspended silence. When my pack was on my shoulders, I took one last look at the clearing, at the trails, at the scraped bark, at the tent that had nearly become my coffin. Then an unsettling thought rose inside me, a thought so quiet, so simple, it chilled me more than anything that happened the night before. I hadn't seen footprints, not of the hunter, not of the hunted. Whatever moved around my camp didn't walk. It pulled itself. Both of them did. I left the clearing without looking back. I couldn't. Something about turning around felt wrong, like the moment I did, the forest would freeze again, and I'd hear that dragging start up behind me, closer than before. So I kept my eyes forward, every sense sharpened, every nerve pulled tight like wire. The trail out looked different in daylight, less like a path and more like a thin strip of earth carved between steep ridges and drop-offs. Linville Gorge always has an edge to it, something ancient, maybe indifferent, maybe watchful, but that morning it felt heavier, like the gorge was holding on to the last pieces of the night, waiting to see what I did with them. As I descended the ridge, I kept glancing to the sides, scanning for any sign of movement. Not a deer, not a rustle, not even the sight of a bird lifting from a branch. The woods were awake now, yes, but they weren't calm. They were cautious, observing. As if the things that moved during the night had left a stain on the forest floor that everything else could still smell. About a half mile from my camp, I found something I didn't expect. Another drag mark. Fresh. Thin. It cut across the trail, angling downhill into an area thick with rhododendron and boulders. It wasn't as wide as the one near my camp. This one was narrow, shallow, but unmistakably similar. Something had passed through the area only hours earlier, and whatever it was, it hadn't gone back the way it came. I felt myself slowing, staring at that mark, trying to make sense of why it continued so far. The night visitor, the wounded one, shouldn't have had the strength to travel this distance. Not after the way it moved, not with the way it breathed. Something should have stopped it, unless something was helping it, or hurting it, or pushing it. That was the part I couldn't shake. The dragging wasn't meandering. It wasn't random. It was directional, purposeful, like something being forced down into the deeper parts of the gorge. I stood there longer than I should have, listening. The morning breeze whispered through the leaves, gentle now, almost apologetic, as if the forest was trying to erase the memory of those two presences from the night before. But the deeper wind, the one that pushed through the ravines, carried a colder echo, a faint, hollow resonance rolling up from below. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded like breath. Slow, weak, fading. That was enough. I backed away from the mark and continued down the trail quicker than before, fighting the urge to break into a full run. The sun was higher now, but it didn't warm me. It felt distant, thin, like it was fighting through something unseen. By the time I reached the trailhead, my pack straps were soaked with sweat, not from exertion, from the tension that had held me rigid for nearly 4 hours straight. My truck was the only one in the gravel lot. When I opened the door, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked older, edges sharper, eyes sunken and wide like I hadn't slept in days. Maybe I hadn't, not in the ways that count. Before I started the engine, I sat staring at the tree line. The sun lit it beautifully, gold against dark green, peaceful the way the gorge pretends to be when it wants you to let your guard down. And for a moment, I almost convinced myself that the dragging, the breathing, the presence in the dark, all of it had been some strange trick of fear and isolation. But then the breeze shifted again, pushing down from the ridge. I heard it, faint, almost swallowed by the wind, a low, distant exhale rolling through the trees. Not close, not chasing, just there, lingering. The wounded one wasn't the only thing down there. Something else had been moving beside it. Something uninjured, something in control. And the worst part wasn't that I had camped between them. It was that neither of them had shown any interest in me. I was just an obstacle in their path. A momentary pause in something older, something ongoing, something that did not stop when the sun came up. As I finally pulled out of the lot and watched the gorge disappear in the rearview mirror, a thought settled across my mind like cold ash. Whatever dragged itself across the leaves that night, whatever hunted it, they weren't passing through. They live there, and no one who camps on that ridge ever really sleeps alone.